The death dumps, otherwise known as chemical trails, are being dropped and sprayed throughout the United States, in England, Scotland, Ireland, Northern Europe, and I have personally seen them not only in the United States but in Mexico and Canada. Birds are dying around the world. Fish are dying by the hundreds of thousands around the world. This is genocide. This is poison. This is murder by the United Nations. This element within our society that's doing this must be stopped. I happen to know of 2 of the locations where the airplanes are that dump this crap on us. 4 of the planes are out of the Air National Guard, Lincoln, Nebraska, and the other planes are out of Fort Still, Oklahoma. I personally have observed the planes that were standing still in Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska, at the Air National Guard. They have no markings on them. They're huge, bomber-like airplanes with no markings. This is a crime. Crime against humanity, crime against America, crime against the citizens of this great country. They must be stopped. What is wrong with Congress? This has an effect on their population and their people and their friends and their relatives and themselves. What's wrong with them? What's wrong with the pilots who are flying these airplanes? They're dumping this crap, this poison, on their own families. Somebody has to do something about it. Somebody in Congress has to step forward and stop it now. Thank you. I'm Ted Gunderson.
The opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of the staff or the management or the sponsors. The sponsors of the Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Monday edition of the Power Hour. Just a little tongue-in-cheek stuff going on there. Anybody living near an airport can relate to that. And that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. This is Dave Von Cloyce.
And Joyce Riley. And the subject is going to be the purpose of chemtrail aerosol. A.C. Griffith was associated with the National Security Agency. He carried a top-secret clearance, a cryptographic clearance, and in more recent times he was associated with the Central Intelligence Agency operations. He was married to a lady lawyer, judge, and his father-in-law was a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Virginia. He is with us today, and we want to say thank you very much, A.C. Griffith, for joining us to talk about the purpose of chemtrail aerosol. Thank you, sir, for joining us on the Power Hour today.
Thank you, Joyce. It's indeed a pleasure to be with you today.
Well, I must tell you, I think the listeners are going to get more today than they probably imagined, given the fact that you have some information that most people do not have access to, and probably information we would just as soon not know. However, knowledge is power, and we thank you for joining us, and I know that you have listened to the Power Hour in the past and have been very supportive of the activities and providing information to the Power Hour. Let's talk just as much as you want to talk about what your past experience was all about, sir.
I spent a couple days making talking points to make a guide map of how to present this to you. It is such a big topic. It's very difficult to know where to grab it to begin. Several years ago, I got a telephone call from Mike Blair at the Spotlight newspaper in Washington, now called the American Free Press. He asked me to help work with him on the story of the white trails coming out of the airplanes. And time is going by. I guess that was 8 or 9 years ago. We actually got inside the program. We're the only people in the world that actually got inside of that program.
When you say you got inside that program,
the aerosol program, the chemtrail program,
you're talking about information on the inside of this program.
I'm talking about actually getting inside the program at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base where it's being managed.
Wow.
And we actually got into some of the people that were dissatisfied from within the program, and they divulged a lot of the acronyms and the purpose of the program and so on. And that's the only way that anybody could ever have broken the secrecy of this program.
Okay.
We know that people have died over this program. People have been hit to keep them quiet. And we know that other things have happened to keep people in this program. One of the key people that designed the aerosol, the barium salt aerosol, was set up by people in the Reagan administration, and he's now sitting in federal penitentiary. They still go to him to ask him questions, but yet he is in the prison. That is a little unnerving, isn't it?
Yes, it is, absolutely.
That the man that designed the barium salt aerosol is sitting in a prison.
Well, it would sort of make sense. Now, before we go any further, let's just define what you believe to be the aerosol crime issue. I mean, just what is this aerosol that we're discussing? I mean, it comes out of aircraft, we believe, or we know, and that is the basis of a program that is set up to not do good to this country, but probably do harm. Now, I remember we had a couple of people on the program recently. You contacted me after that, and you said, Joyce, some of the information was accurate, some of it was inaccurate. But what we do know is there's something in the skies that should not be there.
The white trail is not coming out of the engines. It's coming out of aerosol units on the aircraft. In the very beginning, the early days, the aircraft were flying relatively low, 10,000 feet or below, and they were developing the program. They were mostly contract aircraft, mostly CIA aircraft. Now the program has been expanded, and commercial airliners have been outfitted with aerosol units that are controlled through computer systems and satellites to dispense a barium salt mixture. It's a mixture of barium salt, not coming out of the engine. It's coming out of aerosols. And we have checked on information. We do confirm that the name of the project is Project Cloverleaf in the aircraft industry. It is very secretive. It is the most secretive thing I have ever encountered. People have died over this, talking about it. I listened to your broadcast just a few minutes ago. The general was on saying that he is very patriotic and he feels compelled to speak out, and that's exactly the same way I feel. I am very patriotic. I was born before the Second World War. I'm an old guy, and I come from that generation and that mindset. This is my country, and I see my country being dissolved. My country is being destroyed right in front of my eyes, and the people are being hurt, and that's why I consented to be on your radio program today. I know you will remember that you've asked me many times to do this, and I've been very reluctant, but it's time. It's time to speak out and go public with these things.
Well, that is correct. I have asked AC to be on this program many, many times, and you do this, I think, with a considerable amount of risk to your own life, do you not? Yes,
that's right.
So there are people who have lost their lives, people who are now in prison as a result of divulging this information. Now, you were, as you say, very patriotic. You still are very patriotic, and you were doing this out of patriotism, out of love for your country.
As I know you are.
That's correct. That's correct.
You know, Joyce, I'm in Richmond, Virginia, just a few miles from the spot that Patrick Henry stood in 1775. He was talking to Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, George Wythe, and others in St. John's Church. And they were talking about the oppression coming from England at the time. And he was a little put out at them for not deciding a course. And he concluded his speech to them with, "I know not what course others may choose, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." And I think we're approaching a time like that. Mm-hmm. Don't you?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question in my mind. I talked with you about a discussion I had had with a military member who admitted to me, well, first of all, he did not believe that there was such a program. However, he was stationed at one of the bases where I knew some of the operations were taking place on this aerosol clouding or aerosol dispersion or whatever you want to call it. And I had him go to the person who we knew was in charge at that base at that time. And he did, in fact, confirm that the person that admitted to some of the information that we're about to talk about here, or that some of the information regarding this program. And he was so disillusioned when I talked with this military officer. He said, I am leaving the military, Joyce. I did not believe you when you told me about Gulf War illness. And then he said, I became ill. Then I found out the doxycycline was true. And then now I have found out about this spraying issue. And he said, I can no longer serve the military. Well, let's talk about this subject of what the aerosol program is and how you were able to obtain this information.
First, Joyce, if you will allow me, let me paint a picture, a time picture. At first, you may think it's not related, but you will see that it is related. So if you will indulge me just a minute, let me go back to the Kennedy assassination. Do you remember Jim Garrison in New Orleans, the DA down there, fingered 27 people as being part of the plot to kill the president? Mm-hmm. Carlos Marcello was the major drug dealer in New Orleans, and his people were involved. Now, one of the people associated was a man named Barry Seals. He was a drug dealer and later a CIA operative. The FBI report on Carlos Marcello, the big drug dealer and underworld character, the FBI report said he made his money selling tomatoes and real estate. And that was the FBI evaluation of the #1 drug dealer. Now, remember Barry Seals. Now, fast forward to the Watergate break-in in 1972. Now, I was at the Watergate. The CIA had a rather large international operation there under a corporate name. Then they had other foundations under that and so on. By the way, did you know the Catholic Church built the Watergate complex as a real estate? They didn't know what it was about. Everybody was going in different directions, and that's the same thing we find here in the aerosol program. The pilots probably don't know what they're doing. The crews that put it in, they have no idea what it was for. We believe that it was sold to governments as global warming fix. We believe that, but it wasn't. Here's what it was about. It was about a sub-program, making a sub-program in a Navy program called the Variable Terrain Radio Parabolic Equation, VTRPE, Function over Land Terrain. That's what it's about. That is what it's about. You've heard all kinds of explanations for 7 or 8 years, but it's for the VTRPE. And it's part of the Radio Frequency Mission Planner. It's a system. It's a computer system, RFMP, Radio Frequency Mission Planner, and the VTRPE programs are a sub-program within that system. And it was first put on the Enterprise and aircraft carriers for battlefield imaging. The system would not work over land terrain adequately, or accurately rather, without creating a ducting of radio waves over land terrain, and they use the mixture of barium salt to do that. And that enables the whole system to function. It is the system that the United States uses in Afghanistan and Iraq and probably will use in Iran and some of the other applications. And that's what it's about. It's about the VTRPE. I see we're running out of time, and there's several things that I've just got to mention to you. Now, within the Navy program, we see DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and they're into biologicals, and that's where Clifford shines. He has identified many very harmful biologicals coming out of the aerosols.
And, of course, you're speaking of Clifford Carnicom, just
Clifford
so people
Carnicom, yes.
are aware. And that's carnicom.com. That's CARNICOM.com.
We have the greatest admiration for Clifford, and we have admiration for Scott the weatherman, too. Scott Stevens, he's a man of conviction. We admire him for that. Yes. So DARPA is involved, and DARPA is involved in spraying cities. We caught them spraying Asheville, North Carolina several years ago with a substance called BCTP, developed under one of their contracts at the University of Michigan, and it's an anti-anthrax. So So that was one of the first that we saw coming out of the aircraft. They brought them in and sprayed the city. Strange, Art Bell's mother lived in Asheville, North Carolina, and he talked about it on the air, although he didn't fully understand it. Now, here's the killer. Here's the big one. Recently, we've come upon another danger in the atmosphere over America. It has nothing to do necessarily with the Navy VTRPE or the aerosoling. It is an attack on North American weather. The weather is being manipulated from outside of the country. The hurricane that slammed into New Orleans was guided in there. So was the Hurricane Rita and Gaston and some of the others. We believe that the Russian systems that have been developed since the late 50s, early 60s in Russia is the ultimate weapon, and we have no defenses against it. It's called scalar. That's a modern name for the systems. Scalar weapons. There are three divisions of scalar coming against America. One is called energetics, and one is called bioenergetics, and one is called psychoenergetics. The psycho function can actually manipulate mind, thoughts, personalities, and cause astronaut Lisa to wear a diaper driving across the country.
Really?
That kind of thing, yes. There was an admiral on an aircraft recently that stood up and said to everybody on the plane that he had smallpox, and they took him off the plane. He was in medicine. That was psychoenergetics. It's functions on the mind and mind functions. You can actually insert another personality in the person. The bio comes against living bodies, their biochemistry. And the energetics can come against the Challenger, the Columbia, the Thrasher submarine, where 129 men died. Those were, we believe, we are sure they were attacks by Russian scalar weapons. They're actually interferometer transmitters used in an interferometer way with two transmitters intersecting over North America. That's
now, just
what's happening.
for those that don't understand scalar, would you define a scalar or tell us what scalar weaponry is?
It's very complicated. If I read you the definition, you still wouldn't know. But on the website linked with you, the mysterious booms, you will find a link to Tom Bearden, Colonel Bearden in Huntsville. He defines all of that and tells quite a story about it. Tom Bearden has been the Tesla guru for many years. He is highly respected. He is a brilliant man and a great American.
Mm-hmm. And he is speaking out also. Or he has in the past.
He has in the past, yes.
Right, he is not speaking out now.
We'll talk about that off the air. I don't want to get people hurt. This is a very dangerous thing to get into. I can't stress that enough. The scalar transmitters in Russia are controlled by the Federal Security Service. It's abbreviated FSB, but it actually stands for the Federal Security Service, the old KGB, and not necessarily under the direct control of the Russian government. It's quite a story to this. The woodpecker transmitters that have been going on for 25, 30 years over North America are part of the weapons system coming against North America. We're experiencing and hearing from people all over the country that are experiencing dizzy spells, and they fall forward to the left. They're dizzy, forward to the left. I'm sure many of your listeners right now are saying, my God, that's happened to me. Well, it's happening all over the country, and that is the manifestation of these scalar weapon systems. The town in Kansas was devastated as a result of guiding and manufacturing that storm. Now, that's going to increase in the rest of this year. The hurricanes were suppressed last year, but hopefully the United States science community will be able to suppress them again. That is the real threat against us right now, is the Russian. Now, other countries have these weapon systems. We are late coming up to speed. We do not have adequate defenses against them right now. I will tell you that Israel stood between the United States and Russia with its defenses. Israel protected the United States on several occasions when we got right down to the line. There's been some white knuckle time with this, and the people are completely oblivious to it. But again, we're sure that the Challenger was taken down, and other aircraft, other commercial aircraft on the West Coast. Alaskan Airlines has been having a lot of trouble running into these scalar fields, but nobody knows about it. Back when I was like 19 years old, I first went into the service. We were in the Philippines, and in intelligence, we would penetrate Chinese airspace on a regular basis. We would penetrate the space to see how they would react, and we would listen to their communications, their military, and we would know something about their defenses. Well, the Russians are doing the very same thing to us right now, and we're not responding. It's as though we have no idea what's going on. And each time that happens, they become more confident. If we go into Iran, God only knows what's going to happen. But if we don't go into Iran, God only knows what's going to happen to us. So I can see some real desperate times ahead. We also know in the study of this, as I told you earlier, when we started looking at this, there was one door, and then all of a sudden we saw 2 doors, then 4 doors, then 8 doors, then 16 doors, and 32 doors to explore, and that's why it's taken all of these years to do that. We know that atomic devices have been pre-positioned in American cities. We know that Israel pre-positioned atomic devices in Russian cities. So there's some standoff here, but we are in a desperate time, and people are oblivious to it.
Well, I'm afraid that you're right on the oblivious part, because people cannot believe that this country would do that because of the facade of, oh, we care about your freedom and we're there for you, and we want to provide the most strong military to protect you. And they hate freedom, and that's why they're after us. And all these phony things that we have been fed. But, you know, there is a paper that was done, and I really appreciate receiving this. It was a thesis by Matthew Doggett that, as I understand, is not on the internet, about the documentation behind what you're talking about here with respect to this project. And I just want to say, ladies and gentlemen, it's called an atmospheric sensitivity and validation study of the variable terrain radio parabolic equation model, or the VTRPE, as A.C. Griffith was just discussing. Now, can you just help us understand?
Now, the Department of Defense is on high alert here in the U.S., but it's not because of a possible terrorist attack. No, they're worried about the hacktivist group Anonymous. The Pentagon is investigating claims that the group has threatened to cause problems at Quantico, Virginia, the base where Private Bradley Manning is being held. Now, Manning is suspected of leaking thousands of documents to the website WikiLeaks, and he's been locked in Quantico since last July. And lawyers for Manning claim that he's been left in solitary confinement at the base, forced to strip naked because military officials believe that he's a threat to himself. But his legal team says that that's not the case, and that the treatment is inhumane. Now, the Financial Times reports that the hackers known as Anonymous have been seeking to disrupt communications at the U.S. Marine base. And as you might recall, Anonymous, they're the ones that stage cyber attacks on the websites of Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, and others, accusing them of withdrawing services to WikiLeaks. Now, among the methods that the group is vowing to use is one called posting personal information about the officials on the internet, a method known as doxing. Now, the group has also threatened to harass the staff at Quantico to, quote, the point of frustration, including a, quote, complete communications shutdown of its internet and phone links. So Anonymous has been very successful with all their other targets. So the DoD and Quantico should probably be on high alert. So it looks like the DoD really does have reason to be shaking in its boots.
What we're dealing with here is a total lack of respect for the law.
that the FDA, which is the watchdog of American safety that we have empowered to protect the American public against food additives and drugs, has repeatedly reviewed all of the data that has been forthcoming from hundreds of studies about aspartame.
But the fact is, this thing has been carefully studied, repeatedly studied, extensively studied, so that, as I said before, the FDA concluded it's one of the most thoroughly tested food additives they've ever seen. And the conclusion is that it's safe.
The same building blocks that are found in all of the proteins that we eat, whether they be bananas or meat or peanuts or what have you, they are found in NutraSweet.
NutraSweet, or aspartame, is the most studied food ingredient ever approved by the FDA, and not just by the FDA, but by more than 70 regulatory bodies around the world.
But the fact is, this thing has been carefully studied, repeatedly studied, extensively studied, so that, as I said before, the FDA concluded it's one of the most thoroughly tested food additives they've ever seen. And the conclusion is that it's safe.
They had made the claim years ago that they would help and support any legitimate researcher, that they would supply aspartame and be helpful in any research. I had published my anecdotal studies, and I had written a chapter in Richard Wortman's book, so I think the industry knew of my stance already. But then, in the mid-90s, I wrote to the company stating that we wanted to do a double-blind study because my earlier work had indeed been, quote, anecdotal. And I pointed out that they had made the claim that they would supply aspartame to any legitimate researcher. At that point, I was a professor at Utah, Northeastern Iowa University's College of Medicine. I think I would qualify as a legitimate researcher. The company, I sent the protocol for the study to the company, and they responded that this was unnecessary research and would not supply us with aspartame. I offered to buy the aspartame. They refused. They put up roadblocks. They made it very difficult for us to purchase aspartame. We had to go around them. We finally did get USP-grade aspartame from Schweitzer, from a private firm, but the point is that the NutraSweet company made it very, very difficult, didn't follow through on their promise to supply aspartame to any legitimate researcher. Said this was unnecessary, shouldn't be done, needn't be done, and they tried to block it.
The GD Searle Company, in the quest to get approval for their product, aspartame, they conducted a study on animals in which they fed some animals, like I said, low dose, medium dose, high dose of the product, and then they used control animals that supposedly did not get any of the product. When they submitted this to the FDA and the FDA looked at it, there was some question about the study. Well, one of the scientists, a neuroscientist, looked at some of this, and he saw a lot of red flags. He said there's some real questions here about tumors being caused by this product, particularly brain tumors. So they ordered a study to be done by the Bureau of Foods, which was the precursor to the FDA. And Dr. Jerome Bressler was in charge of this group to look through the research that had been done by GD Searle, and that's what the Bressler report is about. And this is the report here. And basically what it shows is that either a lot of purposeful shenanigans was carried on to get this product approved, or, as he states it, it was the world's worst research. They found that what they did is the animals that died after being fed NutraSweet, they didn't autopsy the animals right away. Some of them were not autopsied more than a year afterwards. And of course the tissues broke down and liquefied, and so they couldn't do proper studies on them, but they reported it as if they had, and they reported these as normal. They found that they were taking tumors and cutting them out and throwing them away and saying the animal was normal. They had animal tissues that had obvious tumors in it that were reported normal. They had, in one of the cases here that's reported, a lymph node that was enlarged. And this GD Searle pathologist reported it as a normal lymph node. When the scientists from the Bureau of Foods looked at it, they said it was an obvious lymphosarcoma, a highly malignant tumor. The notations about the testicular atrophy were not noted. There were just numerous things in this report that showed that, in my estimation, there was an effort to cover up what was being found so that they could get approval.
There were so many things wrong with the submitted data from GD Searle originally. They had a monkey study, and in this monkey study they were fed aspartame, and they were fed aspartame with milk. The milk, as you know, normally slows down the absorption of certain chemicals when you drink milk. If you take aspirin in milk, it'll take much longer for the aspirin to go to work. Well, even though the monkeys were drinking aspartame and milk, out of the 7 monkeys they had, I think 1 or 2 died and 4 or 5 had grand mal seizures. Now, these test results were not satisfactory to GD Searle. They weren't going to be able to show these to FDA, saying, hey, look, aspartame, even with milk, caused monkeys to have grand mal seizures.
Developing a society because of all of these different toxins known to affect brain function. We're seeing a society that not only has a lot more people of lower IQ, but a lot fewer people of higher IQ. In other words, a dumbing down, a chemical dumbing down of society. So everyone's sort of mediocre. That leaves them dependent on government because they can't excel. We have these people of lower IQ who are totally dependent. Then we have this mass of people who are going to believe anything they're told because they can't really think clearly. And very few people of very high IQ who have good cognitive function who can figure this all out. And that's what they want. So, you know, you can kind of piece it together as to why they are so insistent in spending so many hundreds of millions of dollars of propaganda money to dumb down society.
Lord, I wonder what's got the matter. I try and know it's
like to do well at things. It's important to me that if you're given an assignment that you try to do it the best you can. I'm afraid that some people confuse that with some sort of single-mindedness on my part.
One night, about a month or so after Rosemary passed away and went to be with Jesus, I found this note. I went into the study and I picked up an old Bible that I hadn't used in years and took it in the kitchen and wiped it off. It was a little dusty, and I opened it up and I found this note, and I have any idea when she wrote this, but it says, "I love you very much, Ronnie." She used to call me Ronnie, and she signed it, "Your Sweetie Petey." That was my nickname for her, Sweetie Petey. And like I say, I don't know when she put it in there, but I sure needed it that night. I'm Ron Dodge from Thibodaux, Louisiana, and my wife Rosemary, who was my bride for 45 years, when we were coming back from Montana in Oklahoma in the summer of 1998, July 8th, she got a seizure. Of course, we didn't know what had happened because both of us have been in very good health. And within 4 weeks, we found out that she had a brain tumor, and subsequently was operated on. And she lived for 13 months after that and passed away. And we found out that what caused her brain tumor was Diet Coke, aspartame. It's deadly, deadly poison. In fact, it's 3 deadly poisons in one. It's made up of aspartic acid, phenylalanine, and methanol. And all 3 of them are neurotoxins. They cross the blood-brain barrier and attack the brain, excite the brain cells to death, cause tumors. Of course, they cause breast tumors too, and Alzheimer's, lupus, blindness, fibromyalgia, heart attacks. My brother-in-law died from drinking too much Diet Coke with a heart attack. So this stuff is deadly. And millions of people are already dead from this. And millions of more are going to die. And what's really sad is that I found out that they knew it was poison when they put it in there. They knew it would do these things. They already tested it, and it caused brain tumors and other problems. And the FDA had turned it down in the 60s, the 70s, and in the 80s. Monsanto bought out Cyril Drug, began to manufacture this stuff, paid off the FDA. They turned it down, but the head of the FDA, Hayes, overrode the board, okayed this stuff, and they put it on the market. And the soft drink industry issued a 16-page report condemning it before it was okayed by the FDA. But once the FDA okayed it, they jumped on it and made millions on it. And if you're using any kind of diet products, you're going to die. It's just that simple. It'll kill you. And the patent rights ran out. Now they're putting this aspartame in over 9,000 products. So not just diet products, but it's in regular products instead of sugar, or mixing it with sugar. And they don't even have to put it on the label as aspartame. However, one of the 3 poisons in aspartame, they do have to, by law, label it, and that's phenylalanine. That has to be put on the label. And if it has that on the label, you know it's got aspartame in it. Avoid it like the plague. Their families are dying, and they don't even know why. And this is why. This is what's giving them the diseases that they're getting. Rosemary, she was such a beautiful, talented lady, and she did not deserve to die like this. Don't let your family die. Get them off this stuff. If you got to slap it out of their hand, it's better to make them mad than to have them dead. It's hard for me to get out of the grocery because every time I go in there, I see people with diet drinks in their baskets, and I've got to stop them and tell them. Of course, I've warned thousands of people about this because I know that they're going to die. Them or their husband or wives, you know, and you just have to warn them. In fact, when I warn anybody, I make them promise that they will warn at least 10 other people, and make these people promise to warn 10 others. If everybody does that, this word will spread like wildfire. I thought it was just for the money that they did this. Then I found out the head of Monsanto is a Bilderberger, one of the men that run the world, you know, and their agenda is to reduce the population of the world by 80%. So this is a killing machine that they're using. Like I say, millions are dead, hundreds of millions will die before this thing's over with, worldwide. You know, there's a lot of symptoms that arise when you're drinking this stuff or eating something with aspartame in it. You know, headaches, blurred vision, sometimes it affects the stomach, heart palpitations, so it affects different people in different ways. There's a very good website that you can acquire a lot of information on, and that's doorway.com, D-O-R-1-O, D-O-R-W-A-Y.com. Or you can also punch in just aspartame, and there's a lot of information will come up. Or another website, aspartamekills.com. You can also go to infowars.com and then click up on aspartame. It'll give you a tremendous amount of information. Not only that, on infowars.com you can see how they're using these kind of things to control population in the world. Men like Ted Turner, whose quote was that the world can only sustain 350 million people and everyone else has to be eliminated. This is a quote that he made about 3 years ago. And last year he gave $1 billion to the United Nations for population control. So these are the this is their mindset, and these are the kind of men that are creating these kind of problems, as well as a lot of other biological problems in the world. So get informed, find out what's going on, and get on those websites and get educated, and tell your neighbor, tell your friends. We need to help stop this thing as soon as we can.
Well, Ron, you have been a great help to us in rebuilding the church at Mount Carmel, and you drove. How many hours did you drive?
It's 10, 11 hours.
Just God bless you for speaking out about this issue, because I don't think there's a handful of people that are speaking out against it. Just tell us one more, how does it, explain to the people how it makes you feel that these people has killed your wife.
Rosemary and I were in a business together, and we have a big changeable sign in front of our business, which we closed down now, you know. And I put up on that sign for everybody to read that goes by, and thousands of people pass there every day. The FDA, Monsanto, and Coca-Cola murdered my darling Rosemary. And that pretty much says it all. They're a bunch of scumbag killers. They don't care about people. They just care about power, control, and money. And when I see someone else using these products, I just know they're going to die, and I just want to warn them. I just want to tell them, don't do it. Don't do it. Stop now while you can.
What is the central message you want to get to these people?
Quite often, because something's put in a food product, we think, well, it's got to be safe or they wouldn't put it in there. But this is not the case today. They've got to realize they're in danger. Their loved ones are in danger. They got to stop and think about what it would mean to lose their husband or their wife or their child. Children are drinking this stuff. See? Pregnant women are drinking it. They're going to lose their babies. I mean, this stuff kills. It's poison. They need to be aware of that, and they need to. Now that you know about this, everyone that's looking at this, you now have an obligation to warn others. It's just that simple. You know about it. Maybe your life's been saved by this. You have to warn others. You have to spread the word. You can't let this thing go on. I can't let it go on. It would have been nice just to crawl away and grieve about this. But I know Rosemary would have wanted me to warn others about this. She was such a beautiful lady. And, I miss her. I miss her a lot. That's all I got to say.
God bless you.
Well, you've heard the concern about sugar, and therefore millions of Americans have turned to artificial sweeteners. The big three are aspartame, usually found in NutraSweet, sucralose, which is in Splenda, and saccharin. But are they a healthy alternative to sugar? Here's medical reporter Galen Tethrow.
Why are things so good? I'm telling you why. NutraSweet is why.
Those were the good old days when manufactured sweeteners like aspartame delivered sweetness and promised good health. We'd all be thin and happy.
It's not quite that simple, because we now know data from Harvard Medical School that children who eat diet sodas gain weight. Well, how could this be? There's no calories.
Dr. Barry Sears says more and more research shows this empty sweetness makes the body expect food. When it doesn't arrive, you actually get hungrier.
And so this begins to explain the paradox. The more basically sugar-free soft drinks you drink, the fatter you become.
And not only may artificial sweeteners increase obesity, many experts say they're bad for you in other ways.
So why am I pouring a Diet Cola into a hot pan? Well, the heat simulates what happens in your body when you consume aspartame, breaking it down into toxic formaldehyde.
Food scientist Woodrow Monty explains that the aspartame molecule contains a precursor to formaldehyde, methyl alcohol.
in the circulation of the brain and the veins and arteries of the brain, there's an enzyme that can convert methyl alcohol to formaldehyde, and in the human breast.
Monty says that means an increased risk of breast cancer. This chart shows how breast cancer has risen along with the increased use of aspartame. That conversion into formaldehyde could also mean multiple sclerosis. With MS, the body attacks the nervous system and scars the brain. Plus, this Chinese study found that even extremely low doses of formaldehyde damage the brain's memory proteins.
It could start changing its structure and the way it folds, and start producing strange misformations and malformations, the same kind of malformations that we find in Alzheimer's disease.
After the Food and Drug Administration approved aspartame in 1981, Monty wrote of his concerns that the sweetener might cause cancer, as well as genetic damage and birth defects.
We did not know, and I said we do not know, but we're experimenting. Well, now we do know, and the answer to all three of those questions is yes, yes, and yes.
Recently, when leading European researchers found a cancer connection, the government still wouldn't budge. FDA finds no reason to alter its previous conclusion that aspartame is safe as a general-purpose sweetener in food. Yet the International Agency for Research on Cancer now names formaldehyde, produced in the body by aspartame, as definitely causing cancer. Janet Starr-Hull says aspartame caused her potentially fatal thyroid disease in the early 90s. She wrote Sweet Poison describing her affliction and recovery. And those experiences motivated her to investigate the 1998 FDA approval of another artificial sweetener, Splenda, also known as sucralose.
Everything that we had warned about aspartame, please don't do it, don't give it to your child, don't use it during pregnancy, don't give it to the elderly or those that are sick, we're having to say the same thing about Splenda.
The FDA says the agency looked at 110 sucralose studies in humans and animals. They concluded many of the studies were designed to identify possible toxic effects, including carcinogenic, reproductive, and neurological effects. No such effects were found. Hull disagrees about what those studies found.
Cancer in the laboratory, mice, had hind leg paralysis. The male rats had infertility issues. The female rats had aborted fetuses and problems during pregnancy.
Her doubts about Splenda focus on the fact that it's manufactured from sugar by adding 3 chlorine atoms.
How much chlorine, how much do you consume every day? Do you consume your swimming pool? Do you drink that water when you swim?
Hull says the more you use, the more you lose, with potential asthma and breathing difficulties, sinus issues, even bladder and kidney problems. Again, the government says no problem. The body can't even digest Splenda. Hull disagrees.
They're even saying in some Japanese studies it can digest up to 27%. So what you're looking at is the body really is going to break this down into chlorine.
With serious concerns about Splenda and aspartame, what about saccharin? After all, it used to carry a cancer warning. In the 80s, aspartame products even advertised no saccharin. However, it's been around for more than 100 years. It's the only artificial sweetener Monty uses because it won't break down into threatening chemicals. Still, he uses it sparingly.
If we make that food that doesn't taste good, whether through sweeteners or artificial flavorings, is that a good thing to do? We're fooling our bodies? You don't want to fool nature.
With the continuing concerns about artificial sweeteners, experts say natural sweeteners, in moderation, may be the best option for health-conscious consumers. Galen Tethrow, CBN News.
Thank you, Galen. We have been warning about aspartame. It will take your mind away. It will reduce your IQ. It will give you headaches. It will give you menstrual problems. It will give you reproductive problems. It is poison. Formaldehyde. It's the same reaction as white lightning, moonshine liquor. Of course, you've never had it.
I've never had moonshine, Pat, but I take your word for it.
Please do. It is death, and the problem is the FDA steadfastly refused to do something about it. They had a faulty study going in, and guess who led the charge to get that approved?
Who?
Take a wild guess, and it's not President Bush. Go ahead.
You?
No, I didn't have to do this study. Donald Rumsfeld.
Oh, him!
Yeah, him.
Tip of my tongue.
Yeah. Sure. He was working for G.D. Searle, and Searle was the one who was putting out aspartame, and he got paid a big salary, and he was pretty clever in Washington, and one of the things they manipulated was to get this thing passed. Now, a lot of people think Splenda is super, and what we've said before on Splenda is sugar treated with chlorine.
People are eating chlorine.
Do you drink pool water when you're swimming?
No.
Well, then you shouldn't drink.
See, this is my theory, and I've said this so many times before, Pat. Just eat real sugar. Just do it and modify it.
That'll do it, or honey,
or
syrup,
yeah.
Maple syrup. I do. You see, the expert, he used what I use, sweet and low. And,
I don't like sweet and low either.
Well, it's tough luck.
I don't like the taste of it. It tastes
you're
gross.
Back to honey, but that's the least obnoxious. And we've had people say, "Oh, you ought to go with Splenda," and then there's several others that people use. But in any event, I know one person who just kept getting heavier and heavier, and boy, she drank.
Don't say a name.
It certainly wasn't Christy.
Just say a name, Pat.
I'm not. You didn't get heavy and heavy. But, Diet Coke, first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
Diet Coke during the day. Diet Pepsi, Diet this, that, and the other, full of aspartame.
I know, it gives you headaches.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll give you this fact sheet as your sugar substitute, making you fat. This is good stuff, and we'll give it to you free if you just call in 1-800-716-FACT. We just cannot emphasize strongly enough how many people think they're doing the righteous thing with Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi and Diet this and Diet the other with NutraSweet in it. It's bad.
Water. Just drink water.
Well, that's good for you, too.
I think that's very
good
good
what
for
I started doing?
Yes, Pat.
I like that sparkling water, so it's a little more expensive, but stuff
Because you like the kick.
Kick of sparkling water?
Yeah, you put a little lime, a little zest.
Well,
it's a kick.
It's still water. Okay, what's next?
Hand over your heart. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
Оглядывайтесь, мы вас не добили под Сталинградом, на Украине, в Беларуси. Против нас и будете опять готовить нападение, мы так ухнем.
I want American kids to grow up as Americans, and they will, if we have the guts to make our intentions clear. So clear they don't need translation or interpretation, just respect for a country prepared as no country in all history ever was.
In your heart, you know he's right. Vote for Barry Goldwater.
Now we will explore how the American branch of the Illuminati aided and abetted Adolf Hitler, and how the Bushes were the first family when it came to treason.
I've been an investigative reporter and a journalist for 35 years. I've worked in every major media market in the United States, and I've written for more than 100 newspapers and magazines nationally and internationally. So last September 17th, I became the first journalist in U.S. history to go to the U.S. National Archives and the Library of Congress and pore over the thousands of pages of documents in both places to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt or any refutation of the facts that Prescott Bush, the grandfather of George W. Bush, and George Herbert Walker, his maternal great-grandfather for whom his daddy is named, were Nazi traitors to the country who should have been tried for treason. 2 weeks ago, in early August, a major world newspaper, The Guardian of London, finally got on the story internationally, and they flew a renowned reporter of theirs named Duncan Campbell over to Washington to take me back to the archives and Library of Congress so that they could verify that these explosive documents were real and I didn't have forged copies. Prescott Bush was the grandfather of George W. Bush and the father of George Herbert Walker Bush, and George Herbert Walker Bush is named for his father-in-law, George Herbert Walker. Prescott Bush graduated from Yale in 1917 and was in Skull and Bones with E. Roland Harriman, who was the younger brother of W. Averill Harriman. The Bush family really had nothing going. They were essentially social climbers and opportunistic people. At the time that Prescott Bush met Dorothy Walker, he was a tire salesman. And George Herbert Walker, as all fathers do when their daughter's going to marry someone, said in his heart, you know, it's not an appropriate thing socially that my daughter marry a tire salesman. So he brought Prescott Bush first into Brown Brothers Harriman and then Union Banking Corporation. In actuality, it was anything but a bank. It was essentially a Nazi money laundering operation that had a lot of tentacles into a lot of different other businesses. They owned a shipping line called Hamburg American Line, for example, which was the first Nazi front business seized, although the line was no longer operational in 1942. In the early 1930s, it transported Nazi spies into the U.S., and then their promotional ads offered cash rewards to any American citizens who would go back on Hamburg American lines and proselytize for Hitler. 8 months after the U.S. had entered the war, the New York Herald Tribune ran a front-page article, Hitler's Angel has $3 million in U.S. bank. And it caused a major scandal and just rocked the world of politics. Brown Brothers Harriman, which George Herbert Walker and Prescott Bush were affiliated with and partners in, worked with I.G. Farben, which operated Auschwitz. Prescott Bush, he did a number of things that were not only anti-American, but were pro-Hitler, and he did all that he could to proselytize for Hitler and the rise of his Third Reich, because the largest client, Fritz Thyssen, of his patron, W. Averill Harriman, dictated what kind of behavior he would practice to enhance his own career. So he was put on the board of directors of Union Banking Corporation, and he was also a shareholder in Union Banking Corporation along with E. Roland Harriman. But what's interesting about what the documents show is that they clearly state that all of the shareholders were phantom shareholders for Fritz Thyssen and did his bidding directly. So the point I'm making is it's not as if they bought these shares of stock as a passive investment to hopefully profit from the war. They were directly doing the bidding of the individual who built the Nazi war machine. Some very shocking documents that I saw at the Library of Congress 2 weeks ago on August 10th. On August 9th, excuse me, had to do with the hearings of the McCormick-Dickstein Committee of November 1934, show that Prescott Bush and the DuPont family, the Remington family, and J.P. Morgan tried to overthrow the U.S. government, assassinate FDR, and put a Hitler-style fascist state in place. I have in my possession testimony from the McCormick-Dickstein Committee in November of 1934 by one of the fascist plotters that they were going to follow Hitler's model exactly and impose martial law on the United States, round up unemployed people that were worthless to the economy and troublemakers and Jews and put them into internment camps. And their plan was, if necessary, to exterminate the people that could not be part of the effort. The only reason the coup attempt in 1934 didn't succeed is that they hired the wrong general to lead it, General Smedley Butler, the great Marine hero, two-time Congressional Medal of Honor winner, who worked with the plotters just long enough to be able to identify who they were and then blew the whistle on them to Congress. Incredibly, after being warned by the FBI and the Justice Department and the Treasury Department to cease and desist in their Nazi dealings, they had continued them until 1951. There had been 28 additional seizures of Nazi assets and Nazi business fronts between late 1942 and 1951, and that they had moved Nazi assets into Switzerland, Brazil, Argentina, and Panama, and they had continued to do business with their primary Nazi patron, who was Fritz Thyssen, who backed Hitler beginning in 1921 and who was the wealthiest man in Germany, and a steel and coal baron who, with his partner Friedrich Flick, essentially built the Nazi war machine along with I.G. Farben. In 1951, when Fritz Thyssen died in Argentina, Union Banking Corporation was liquidated by the U.S. government, and Prescott Bush received $1.5 million for his holdings in his Nazi business, and that was the beginning of the Bush family fortune for all intents and purposes. George Bush doesn't take his philosophical foundation from the Bible or the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. George Bush takes his inspiration from what he learned in Skull and Bones and from the Thule Society that Hitler and Goebbels and Goring cut their teeth in, Bohemian Grove, these evil organizations that perpetrate the ugly things that these criminals are doing to this country for which they must be held accountable. Now you look at the Republican National Convention this week, and you bring in Arnold Schwarzenegger to speak last night. Schwarzenegger is the son of a Nazi. He has praised Nazis. He has praised Hitler. He talked last night in terms like, we will not falter, we will not waver, we will win this war on terror.
He's a leader who doesn't flinch, who doesn't waver, and does not back down.
Well, that's exactly the speeches that Hitler made after the Reichstag fire. Terrorism and the homeland being under attack are precisely the issues that Hitler used to subvert everything within the German system of government. This is a criminal regime. They not only emulate Hitler, but its genesis comes from Hitler. And I defy anyone, a historian, journalist, author, anyone, to come forward and disprove my premise that you cannot differentiate Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939 and the Reichstag fire and his attempt to dominate the world from George W. Bush's unprovoked invasion of Iraq and subversion of the Constitution through the Patriot Act after 9/11, which I submit is his Reichstag fire. Karl Rove and his minions are every bit the masters of propaganda that Joseph Goebbels was. They literally took lessons from Goebbels and Goring about how to create such brilliant propaganda that unreality can become reality, and reality can be subverted to fantasy political subterfuge right before your eyes. So there's just an endless broken record that is leading up to the present era, that the Bush family has had a single goal for 100 years, which is to become the most powerful family on the planet and to rule the world. And they are on the verge of doing that under George W. Bush. It's critical that every citizen of this country rise up and do something, because the day of reckoning is at hand, and these people are Nazis. They are practicing Nazi philosophy. They are mimicking Nazi tactics, and time is running out.
Let me tell you about Codex Alimentarius. Let me define it for you. Let me help you understand the enemy. And let me assure you that absolutely nothing that I'm going to tell you is exaggerated, is interpolated, or is imagined. Everything I'm going to tell you is documented. And a great deal of it is documented on my website, which is www.healthfreedomusa, one word, healthfreedomusa.org. Let me back up and tell you that I've been watching Codex come toward us for about the last decade. And I've been watching the votes in Congress, which, God help us, is our bastion of support and protection against Codex, and I'll explain why that is. I've been watching the votes to protect our health freedom dwindle until finally in the 109th Congress, without a good deal of activity, we didn't have the votes to protect us. I've been watching Codex accelerate, and I've been watching it expand, and I've been getting more and more troubled. Let me give you a brief rundown of Codex then. After the Second World War, the Nuremberg tribunals were held in which people who had committed crimes against humanity were judged by the world community in a court run by the United States and Britain, and they were sentenced to terms in prison if they were found guilty of crimes against humanity. One of the people found guilty of crimes against humanity was the president of a huge industrial megalith called I.G. Farben. I.G. Farben produced the gas used in the gas chambers, Zyklon B. They produced the steel for the death camps and the railroad lines. They produced the munitions. They produced chemicals. They produced all kinds of stuff. They produced pharmaceuticals. Big, 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 big pharmaceutical company. So the president of I.G. Farben was convicted of crimes against humanity. Now, he's a sort of artistic fellow and creative. He was the one who was responsible for the slogan that people saw as they entered Auschwitz, usually for the last time. Arbeit macht frei. Work brings freedom. Creative sort of fellow. So he was sitting in jail and he said, well, that didn't work. What else can we do? I've got it. Food. He who controls food controls the world. So when he got out of jail, he went to his UN buddies and he said, have I got an idea for you? If we take over food worldwide, we have power worldwide. And his UN buddies said, cool idea. And so they created a trade commission. That's a very important pair of words, a trade commission called the Codex Alimentarius Commission. It is not a public health commission. It is not a consumer protection commission. It is a trade commission. Trade is about what? Money. Business. Trade is about profit. Well, they said in 1962, we're going to work toward total global implementation of Codex Alimentarius on December 31st, 2009. Long term. And they set up a bunch of committees, committees on fish and fishery, fats and oil, fruits and vegetables, ground nuts, nutrition and foods for special dietary uses, and so on. There are currently about 27 Codex committee. There are regional organizations. There are task forces and so on. So it's a huge bureaucratic monstrosity. It's immense. Codex has promulgated well over 4,000 guidelines, standards, and regulations on everything, everything which can legally be put into your mouth, with the exception of pharmaceuticals. They are not part of Codex. Important. Now, Codex standards have no legal weight whatsoever. Zero. So who cares about them? They're just standards. So we're talking about an industry-dominated, regulation-setting organization. But if it has no legal standing, who cares, right? Here's the history of Codex Alimentarius before 1962. The Austro-Hungarian Empire said, we need rules by which the courts can rule on cases involving food. So we'll have regulations and rules that the courts will enforce. That's how they get their weight. That was called the Codex Alimentarius, and it was put into place around 1893 and lasted until the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the First World War. So the idea was there in the Germanic tradition. We need rules, lots of rules, lots and lots of rules. We need a lot of rules. Let's have rules for everything to do with food. So it was sort of a natural extension for the German industrialists to say, we'll go back to the good old days of Codex Alimentarius, back when we had them in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Cool. So they started promulgating their rules and regulations, and they were voluntary. They were sort of guidelines. Now, Codex Alimentarius Commission is administered by the World Health Organization, WHO, and the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. They fund Codex, and they run it at the request of the UN. So they're mommy and daddy to Codex Alimentarius. And that's very interesting, because they're supposed to be about health and food worldwide. Some conflicts of interest that we'll talk about. So Codex started promulgating regulations and rules, and the way that's done is that the committees work up a rule, a standard, a guideline, a regulation, and then they get it to what's called Step 8, which is the final step in their administrative process, and then it's presented to the Codex Alimentarius Commission for ratification, like the Vitamin and Mineral Guideline was presented to the Codex Alimentarius Commission on July 4th this past summer. It was ratified, it was approved by consensus, and it is now, despite the propaganda that you're going to hear, if you ever hear about it in the media, it is now mandatory upon any member country of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Well, what in the world do they have to do with it? And the answer is everything. The World Trade Organization, you see, accepted Codex when the World Trade Organization was formed in 1994. Okay? They said, well, how are we going to decide trade disputes around food if we don't have a set of rules? I know. We'll accept the Codex Alimentarius rules. And all the members of the WTO worldwide will, get ready for an Orwellian term, harmonize with our standards, with the Codex standards. Harmonize. I suggest you capitalize the first 4 letters in your mind. So everybody's supposed to harmonize with Codex. And when they harmonize with Codex, then if they get pulled into the World Trade Organization dispute resolution process, they have a chance of winning. Because, here's the kicker. You ready for this one? If 2 countries go into the World Trade Organization dispute resolution process, and one of them is Codex compliant, and one of them is not Codex compliant, the one that is Codex compliant automatically wins regardless of the merit of the case. People are using Codex compliance as a weapon in a much bigger economic battle. So, every country in the world is racing to do what? To become Codex compliant. So, in the United States, the situation is, okay, how do we become Codex compliant when we have laws that protect us? And you have to remember that Codex does not serve consumer well-being, does not serve health. It serves what I call the 5 bigs. Big Pharma, Big Chema, Big Biotechna, Big Agribiz, and Big Medica. Little you and little me are not served by Codex in the least. So, before we go forward and talk about the rest of what has to happen, let's ask what Codex does. You probably all know about the Vitamin and Mineral Guideline that was ratified on July 4th. You may not know that although it is said that Codex guidelines, regulations, and standards which have been ratified are voluntary, they are not voluntary. That is known as a lie. They classifies nutrients and herbs are mandatory, but they are not fully mandatory until December 31st, 2009. They're sort of kind of a little bit mandatory now, and they're totally mandatory then. Okay, so what does Codex do? Why do I care enough about Codex to close my practice and stop treating patients who came to me from around the world to help them regain their health and be radiantly well with non-toxic means, which is a very satisfying thing to do. I love it. And it also provided me with an income. That was nice. Why am I concerned enough? Okay, let's talk about the Vitamin and Mineral Guideline first. In 1994, here in the United States, DSHEA, the Dietary Supplements, Health and Education Act, was passed, which classifies nutrients and herbs as foods. As foods, you can set no upper limit on them. You cannot set an upper limit on lettuce, lamb, or rutabagas, And similarly, you cannot set an upper limit on vitamin C, echinacea, ginkgo biloba, vitamin D. And access to nutrients is freely given to us. We are allowed to have any nutrients we want because, and this is a very important point, under common law, anything not forbidden is permitted. Codex, on the other hand, is a Napoleonic Code law system. Under Napoleonic Code, anything not permitted is forbidden. That's called a positive list. So, vitamins and minerals. In 1994, we passed DSHEA. Nutrients are foods. We can have as much of them as we want. It's our business. In 1994, Codex, with no notice here in this country whatsoever, declared nutrients, put on your intellectual seatbelts, declared nutrients to be toxins. They're poisons. Dangerous industrial poisons. As poisons, we have to be protected from them. How do you protect somebody from a poison? You use toxicology. You use a science called risk assessment. A quick primer on risk assessment. First, you take the substance that's poisonous and you feed it to animals and you determine the dose that kills 50% of them. That's called the LD50. Okay? And you extrapolate what the LD50 for a human being might be. Then, you go down to the other end of the dosage range and you start feeding itty-bitty tiny bits of it to test animals. And you come up with the largest possible dose, the maximum permissible upper limit, that can be fed to an animal before a discernible impact is shown. Okay? No discernible impact. Then you divide that by 100. That's how they do it in risk assessment. And now you've got a safety margin. So you've got 1/100th of the dose that can be given, the largest dose that can be given with no discernible impact. Okay? Nutrients under Codex not only are limited to those nutrients on the positive list, and we anticipate there will be 18 of them, and they do not include CoQ10, glucosamine, chondroitin sulfate. They do include fluoride, which, to my knowledge as a physician, has absolutely no biological benefit whatsoever. But it does make people complacent. Fluoride was first used in the Gulag because it was discovered that prisoners who were fed fluoridated water were complacent and you could do anything you wanted to them. They were easy to manage. So you have 18 nutrients. You have itty-bitty, teeny-weeny, little-bitty doses that are determined scientifically to have no effect on any human being. Now, in this country, we have a problem. We have DSHEA. We've got to get rid of DSHEA in order to harmonize with Codex. That part of Codex, anyway. So how do we get rid of DSHEA? We attack it legislatively, of course. And there are 5, count them, 5 bills currently before Congress designed to overturn, gut, invalidate, and otherwise get rid of DSHEA. Because once DSHEA is gone, we can harmonize with the vitamin and mineral guideline. So what we're talking about is waking up one morning and being very surprised to find that high-potency, therapeutically effective, clinically significant nutrients are now illegal in the way that heroin is illegal. Not available with a prescription, illegal. If these nutrients have any impact on the human body, they are illegal. That's just the vitamin and mineral guideline. Let's talk about milk. We have recombinant bovine growth hormone, and now we can choose milk with it or milk without it, butter with it, butter without it, right? Not under Codex, because under Codex, every dairy cow on the planet must be treated with Monsanto's recombinant bovine growth hormone. Furthermore, under Codex, every animal used for food on the planet, whether it has fins, feet, or feathers, every animal on the planet must be treated with subclinical antibiotics. Must be treated with subclinical antibiotics and must be treated with exogenous growth hormones. Codex requires, mandates, that all food be irradiated unless it's eaten locally and raw. All food, including organic food, of course. So is it organic afterwards? Well, of course, the organic standards are incredibly low. The organic standards allow a farmer to use veterinary drugs, including growth hormones, antibiotics, etc., on animals, and then at his whim reclassify them as organic. But farmers are our friends, and they would never do that, right? Right. Codex sets limits for the dangerous industrial chemicals that you can have in your food. And the limits are incredibly high. Go to Codex Alimentarius, do a Google search, and look, you know, there are drop-down menus at the top of the official Codex page. Look at the toxins and the veterinary chemicals and the levels that are set. They are terrifying to me. Terrifying. The names of the chemicals that are permitted and the amounts of the chemicals that are permitted are terrifying to me. Why am I terrified? Well, perhaps I'm just a cowardly person. It's possible. Think about this. In 2001, 176 countries, including the United States, got together and they said there are 12 really bad organic chemicals. They're called POPs, persistent organic pollutants. There are a lot of them, but there are 12 that are so bad that nobody could disagree that those 12 POPs had to be banned worldwide. 9 of the 12 worst organic chemicals known are pesticides, not surprisingly, because they kill things. And, of course, we have many processes and enzyme systems that are very much like insects and other pests, so they're not too good for us. But Codex has different ideas. Codex has brought back 7 of the 9 forbidden POPs that 176 countries banned worldwide. Dieldrin, aldrin, hexachlorobenzene. And the food that is imported from other countries that contains these substances cannot be stopped at our borders, because otherwise it would be, God forbid, a trade violation. That's how Codex works. Codex, according to the World Trade Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization joint projections. Now, I didn't make this up. Please, if you unfastened your intellectual seatbelts, put them back on again. If you do the numbers in the WHO-FAO projections, the epidemiological projections, they estimate, not I, because what do I know? They estimate, they're the experts, that just the vitamin and mineral guideline alone, when it goes into global implementation on December 31st, 2009, will result in a minimum of 3 billion, that's B, bad, big, billion deaths. 1 billion through simple starvation. Those folks who die are not particularly economically successful from the point of view of the corporations. When you're starving to death, how much good can you do when the issue is how much can you buy? Not a lot. Forget them. But the next 2 billion, they will die from the preventable diseases of undernutrition. Cancer, the single most profitable condition ever known to humankind. Cardiovascular disease, a good second. Diabetes, pretty good producer. And a whole host of other preventable diseases. Who will die? Who knows? Who will live? Probably those people who are wealthy enough and powerful enough to have their own pushers of clean food and nutrients. That's who will live. You and I? Probably not. Our children? Probably not. Our grandchildren? Probably not. So we're talking about food regulations that are in fact the legalization of mandated toxicity and undernutrition. It will be illegal if there's a famine in, wherever there's a famine, to ship high nutrient density biscuits to that country, and it will be illegal to distribute them. That's what we're talking about. Codex is big and it's bad, but it's not invulnerable. So the point is that we have to protect ourselves, and I believe that we have to regain global leadership, which we have lost, surrendered, squandered, sold. No global. We have sold. Just joining the World Trade Organization surrendered our sovereignty. However, parenthetically, I have a team of constitutional lawyers looking at the following question. Are we members of the WTO? Because if you remember from high school civics, the way you get a treaty to be a real treaty is to have it ratified by a 2/3 majority of the Senate. And the way we got into the WTO was they passed a law allowing Bill Clinton to fast-track us into the WTO. That's not a treaty. We're not in the WTO. Now, that's a piece of the battle. We will tell George, but I don't think he's going to be relevant by the time we tell him. So that's a piece of it, but that's not going to save our lives right now, because do you know, picture in your mind a wasp or a bee trap where the insect voluntarily goes down the funnel and then can't get up out of the trap again? That's Codex. A regular law can be overturned, it can be repealed, it can be corrected by another piece of legislation. But once we become Codex compliant in any area, as long as we're members of the WTO, it can never be repealed because we have lost the sovereignty to become un-Codex compliant as long as we're in the WTO. So it's like going down that funnel and not being able to get up out of it. So it's very important that we make sure that we do not become Codex compliant. But then we'll be hit with all those big trade sanctions and the country will be destroyed economically, right? No. Remember surprise? One of the principles of war? Remember mass, where you take your strength and put it against the enemy's weakness? Well, here's what we've done. We have a team of lawyers who have spent hundreds of hours with us pro bono. These are good guy lawyers. These two gentlemen and we have spent hundreds of hours studying Codex, understanding its weaknesses, a lot of weaknesses, and constructing a strategy which will take the sucker down. It will take it down. But I need you. You are people that other people come to for information about safe, healthy food and nutrients. You are ready-made dissemination points. You are the 1,000 million, 100 million points of light. Here's what is happening. Every country in the world has to be Codex compliant in order not to get hit by WTO trade sanctions, as I told you. if they're members of Codex and the WTO. And there are a few countries that are not, but I guarantee you they're not of any major significance. So, the question is, what does Codex compliance mean? Well, most people, most countries, most legislators believe that it means they have to adopt as their national standard on that particular subject what Codex ratified. But that's not the case any more than we're in the WTO. That's not the case either. What it means is that the format, the issues, and the subjects covered by a Codex guideline, standard, or regulation have to be addressed in the country's guideline, standard, or regulation on the same topic. So, what we have done is create the first of many alternative Codex guidelines. You can go to our website, www.healthfreedomusa.org, and you will see a little button on the upper right-hand side that says, Sign the Citizens Petition. Now, to briefly digress, a citizen's petition is not like a grocery store petition that you sign and you bring to somebody and you say, I have 200,000 signatures, and they dump it in the wastebasket, because in their mind, it's one signature, you and your friends wrote 200,000 names. No, it is a legal challenge to the policy of the United States government on Codex. It's called a citizen's petition. It's a legal challenge. We're suing the United States government, saying what you're doing is illegal, folks. Let us tell you how. We want hearings of fact. We want redress. We want correction. If we get what we want, that's dandy. If we don't get what we want, we have gone through a process called exhausting administrative remedies. We have made the case ripe for court. Okay, so I need you and everybody you know to sign this citizen's petition saying this is a bad policy, en masse. And you do this on the web, and you'll see the instructions, and we present the thousands and thousands and thousands of actual physical pages that we print out with people's signatures to the U.S. Codex Office and to the FDA, and they don't like that at all. But that's okay. However, this time, this is the Second Amendment of the Citizens Petition that we're asking you to sign. This time, the revised Vitamin and Mineral Guideline is part of it. It's part of the lawsuit saying this needs to be U.S. policy. The more voices that say, this is what I want, and you work for me, Mr. and Mrs. Bureaucrat and Mr. and Mrs. Congressman, Mr. and Mrs. Senator, the more voices, the more weight. So step number one is read and sign the citizen's petition. Step number two is disseminate the information, the web link. Tell everybody you know. Put it out in your office. Get your patients, your friends, your neighbors, your suppliers to sign the citizen's petition. And your suppliers, the companies that you use, are going to tell you that you're out of your minds. They will tell you that Codex is not a problem. And they will tell you, anybody here have a dog? Okay. Dog owners know that you ask a dog to heel, sit, down, saying this needs to be U.S. policy. The more voices that say, this is what I want, and you work for me, Mr. and Mrs. Bureaucrat and Mr. and Mrs. Congressman, Mr. and Mrs. Senator, the more voices, the more weight. So step number one is read and sign the citizen's petition. Step number two is disseminate the information, the web link. Tell everybody you know. Put it out in your office. Get your patients, your friends, your neighbors, your suppliers to sign the citizen's petition. And your suppliers, the companies that you use, are going to tell you that you're out of your minds. They will tell you that Codex is not a problem. And they will tell you, anybody here have a dog? Okay. Dog owners know that you ask a dog to heel, sit, down, stay. That's Codex in this country and worldwide. Because the more people who are in Codex coma, the less trouble they have getting this through. So the NNFA, anybody here ever heard of the NNFA? Everybody's heard of the NNFA. Did you know that the members of the NNFA are not just health food stores and manufacturers, but include companies with names you may have heard? Pfizer, Merck, Monsanto, Bayer, BASF, Archer Daniels Midland, Chemet, Eastman Chemical, I could go on, GlaxoSmithKline Wellcome, Wyeth Arrest, you get the idea. Why? Because after DSHEA was passed and the nutrient business burgeoned, the pharmaceutical folks said, and they're not dumb, said there's gold in them nar pills. And they bought the means of production of many, many, many companies, and they bought the companies themselves. So they're in the nutrient business. What better way to kill the nutrient business, which is not nearly as profitable as the toxic chemical drug business, than to take it over? Works every time, right? CRN. Anybody here know about CRN? Council for Responsible Nutrition. Same members. They have lots of multi-level marketing companies. Same members. Okay? And they're serving their members' needs. They're saying, CRN is saying, yay, Codex is coming. It's going to protect us from those dangerous vitamins and minerals and herbs. And CRN is saying, bye, go to sleep, lullaby, and good night, everything's fine. And they use a report that they commissioned at a reputed cost of $800,000. A report, Sidley, Austin, Brown, and Root, a law firm in Washington, wrote a report for them. And it said, lullaby, and good night, everything's fine. It won't have an impact on the United States, everything's fine. Sidley, Austin, Brown, and Root has one major client whose name you might know, Merck. Now, it's entirely possible that NNFA just did a spectacularly bad job of due diligence, or not. Anyway, the report says everything's fine, everything's dandy, no problem, we've got DSHEA. Yeah, sure we do. Now let's talk about Australia. Remember, 5 laws before Congress to overturn DSHEA. And you can write to Congress on the website. The click of a mouse. I call it riding the freedom mouse.
It's called security.
Now, Congress uses a multiplier of 13,000 to 1. Every email, fax, phone call, letter. Don't write letters. They get decontaminated. They never get to Congress. Every email, fax, and phone call counts as 13,000 constituent opinions. They figure that if you write a letter or send an email, there are 12,999 lazy lunks who can't bother to get to the computer terminal to do the same thing, but they feel the way you do. Interesting. That's power, my friends. That's power. That's 13,000 to 1. So suppose we have 1 million people. Suppose we have 10 million people. Suppose we have 100 million people saying, don't you dare. Now, Congress has one rule above all others. Anybody know what it is? Get reelected. That's the primary rule, the prime directive, as Isaac Asimov would have called it. The prime directive is to get reelected. Now, DSHEA was passed, you may remember, by unanimous congressional consent. Was that because one morning all members of Congress woke up and said, I see the light. Nutrients are better than drugs. No. They said, oh, if I don't go along with this, I'll never be reelected to anything. You're at critical mass. Remember, we were out on the streets and we were up on our hind legs and we were making noise. And we were rallying and we were writing letters and we said, don't you dare take away my health freedom. Remember? And we won. Except we got fat, dumb, and lazy and stopped protecting ourselves. So now we're in the same place again. Except it's all food instead of just nutrients. So that's point number one. Use the Freedom Mouse. Ride the Freedom Mouse. We've made it as easy as possible on the site. Sign up for the emails. I will never sell your information to anyone, I promise. I will never rent it. I will never share it. You'll only get email from me. And we need you to know what's going on. So I'll send you email blasts. I'll send you things that you can do. Or not. You know, it's your choice. Get everybody you know informed. Now, what else can you do? Well, we're going to write a series of Codex alternative guidelines. Everything bad in Codex will have an alternative guideline that turns it into a pro-health guideline. What have we done with the guideline, the vitamin and mineral guideline? You can see that because we have a markup copy that has their guideline crossed out and ours written in on the website. It's right there. What we've done is turn it into something, into a guideline that mandates biochemically, individually determined optimal health. And it's still Codex compliant. So we said, okay, now we need Congress to adopt this. And we need other countries in the world to adopt this. So Bert and I went to Washington, D.C., and we met with Dana Rohrabacher from Orange County, who said to us, he's a representative, he said, I believe in pesticides. I went, He said, I believe in GMOs. I went, He said, I believe in irradiation of food. I went, But, he said, I believe in your right to not be forced to eat foods that have been processed that way more than I believe in those technologies. I will take this on. We said, oh, that's really nice. And he said, now, we need a coalition. So we went across the aisle, or across the office building, to see Peter DeFazio's staff from Oregon, who is a liberal Democrat, whereas Rohrabacher is a Republican, a libertarian Republican. And DeFazio's on board. And we have large numbers of others who actually never heard of Codex before we told them about it. Never heard of Codex. We have called every health legislative aide in Congress, and we have said, what's your congressman's position on Codex? And they've said, bah. We have spoken to the trade legislative assistants. We've said, what's your congressman's position on Codex? And they've said, on what? They don't know. We had a congressional briefing set up on the 20th of September. I was going to address Congress. Tell them about it. I thought that was cool. 10 days before, it became a briefing on something else. Another freedom click. You need to write to Congress on the site and tell them that they need a congressional briefing, by God, and tell them you want me to brief them. They don't know. They've never heard of it any more than the general public has heard of it. Gee, how'd that happen? Who knows? Every negative part of Codex can be overturned by a guideline, a regulation, or a standard that is positive. So we need your help, because the United States leadership in this guideline and all the positive guidelines to follow is what's going to literally save the population of the planet and save your jobs and your children and your families and mine. Thank you.
A chemist from former Nazi Germany, Dr. Fritz Hoffmann, had been hired a few years earlier to spur the search for new behavior-modifying substances. Immediately after the war, he courted the Americans, seeking to ensure a job in the United States.
There was an interest in the U.S. during that time in looking at mood-altering drugs, from LSD to canucleomethylbenzolate and other possible mood-altering drugs. Fritz was interested in that area as well.
Several weeks later, on a windy...
After its experiments on soldiers, the Army saw potential in using LSD and other drugs to sedate and dope enemy troops. In short order, it would be possible to conquer territory without a fight.
His physical actions were noticeably slower.
A short time later, the CIA begins conducting its own LSD experiments in the bohemian New York neighborhood of Greenwich Village on Bedford Street. But unlike the Army experiments, the subjects of these tests, which took place in an apartment disguised as a brothel, would not be informed. The CIA hired prostitutes to pour LSD into their customers' drinks and then lure them into revealing secrets.
My purpose was to see that we got guys up there who we wanted to talk, and through other people we got prostitutes to come in and speak to these guys. And these prostitutes would put something, which I found out later on was LSD, into the drink and make them talk. Either they wanted to talk about narcotics, security, or crime. This was all part of the CIA experiment. They called it dirty tricks.
LSD, it was soon learned, was a much more effective way to loosen the tongue than alcohol was. Deep Creek Lake in western Maryland, a 3-hour drive from Washington. In an isolated vacation house at the edge of the lake, the CIA's Dirty Tricks Department converged here for a meeting with 10 of its scientists in November 1953. The meeting is about artichoke. According to the invitation, it was a conference for sports journalists. But in reality, the participants, one of them Frank Olson, were to be placed under the influence of LSD. One of the drinks has been spiked. Later, it will be said the CIA was conducting a kind of self-test, but without the knowledge of the participants.
I don't think, again from what I heard, that he was drugged because he was a security agent. He was drugged because he talked too much.
When Frank Olson was later briefed about the LSD experiment, he knew immediately what it meant. They had interrogated him with artichoke techniques.
Friday evening, he came home and spent the weekend, in this house with my mother and brother and sister and me. And during much of that weekend, they sat on a sofa, which was just over here, and it was a foggy November weekend, as she described it, and they sort of sat there holding hands and kind of staring out these big windows into the fog. And he described having made something he referred to as a terrible mistake.
The CIA brings Olson, accompanied by an agent, to New York. In the hotel, they are joined by a doctor working for the Secret Service who administers medication. Frank Olson has become a security risk, but it seems the CIA has already found a solution.
They're there.
40 years later, at the Institute for Forensic Medicine at George Washington University, the body of Dr. Frank Olson has been exhumed and is undergoing an autopsy. Eric wants clarity once and for all. And as it turns out, the results of the first autopsy in 1953 in New York were manipulated.
A report from New York City in the medical examiner's office, which I had before me, was totally inaccurate in some very important respects. It talked about lacerations, cuts of the flesh that in all probability might have been caused by glass in the course of his fall. There were no lacerations. They were not there, totally non-existent. We also noticed immediately that he had a hemorrhage, which we call a hematoma. It's what we call a subgaleal hematoma, which is under the skull by the frontal bone. That is only reasonably explainable as having occurred by reason of his being, shall we say, silenced, being rendered unable to defend himself so that he could be tossed out the window.
Stars arranges to visit the Pennsylvania hotel with Armand Pastore, the hotel manager who found Frank Olson that night. Afterwards, he makes his judgment.
It is my view, and that of a number of my team members, not all of them, but a number of my team members, that it was homicide.
That would mean Frank Olson was first knocked out by a targeted blow and then thrown out of the open hotel window. Just a few months before the murder took place, the CIA had this study of assassination prepared, a how-to book for agents on how to kill people without leaving any clues. In this report it says,
the most efficient accident in simple assassination is a fall of 75 feet or more onto a hard surface. In some cases, it will be necessary to stun or drug the subject before dropping him.
What was spelled out in that assassination manual was almost letter for letter what happened to Dr. Olson. And it was a protocol, as we call it, for an assassination which fit like the fingers in a glove.
So was it in fact murder? But for what reason? Why did Olson speak of a terrible mistake he had made?
There's a piece missing, and I'm not sure that I'm the one to give it to you. Well, what happened was that he just got involved in it in a way that he was not happy about it, but there's nothing he could do about it. He was CIA, and they took it to the end.
Summer 1953. Frank Olson and his father-in-law cut down a tree. Then the family goes to Tupper Lake on vacation, just like every year, with Arthur Vidic, his wife, and their children. Everything seems the same as always, but that appearance is deceiving. Frank is troubled by something, and he makes an attempt to confide in his brother-in-law, Art.
I'd never had a conversation with him about anything that might have involved moral values. What startled me about it was that he had mentioned the Bible and that he was struggling with something. You knew that there was a problem that he was attempting to confront. But what that problem was, I didn't know. I can visualize his face, actually. It was drawn in a way I'd never seen him before.
While the family enjoys summertime at the lake, Frank retreats into his own world.
My mother also recalled that my father was short-tempered during that last summer, and that she knew that he had been going through some kind of crisis. I mean, she knew he hadn't been sleeping well, and she knew he wasn't really at peace. He had been agitated and worried about something, and had, from time to time discussed leaving Dietrich, leaving his job and retraining himself as a dentist. And she had encouraged him to do this, if that's what he wanted to do.
In Asia at the time, a bitter war was going on between Allied U.S. troops against the North Koreans and Chinese. It had already been going on for 3 years. It was the first long-awaited and long-feared battle between the West and communism. Could the Korean War have anything to do with Frank's personal problems? He still has an office here in Fort Detrick, in the U.S. Army Center for Biological Weapons. At the same time, he is working for the CIA. Among the tasks of the Dirty Tricks Department in Building 1412 are brainwashing, drugs, and torture, as well as murder by means of poisons and bacteria. On July 17, 1953, Olson celebrates his 43rd birthday with friends. A few days later, he leaves for the last trip he will ever take. He took his...
Then, have you noticed Blair now wants to bring in fluoride in the water, and of course all around the world they're doing that. In America, fluoride in the water, good for teeth. Crap! In Toronto, there's a guy called Lineback who was one of the greatest supporters of fluoride in the water. He's the head of dentistry at Toronto University. He's come out now and said, for God's sake, don't have it, don't have it. And as he was saying, they've had it in the water for years, decades in Toronto. They don't have it in the water in Vancouver. There are fewer cavities by a mile per head of population in Vancouver than there are in Toronto. Hey, it's good for teeth. Hey, wait, let's see what it's really about. Do you know when fluoride was first put in drinking water? In the Nazi concentration camp. Stands back in amazement, can't believe it. This is Charles Perkins, a chemist, who wrote to the Lee Foundation for Nutritional Research, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in 1954, and this is what he wrote. In the 1930s, Hitler and the German Nazis envisaged a world to be dominated and controlled by a Nazi philosophy of pan-Germanism. The German chemists worked out a very ingenious and far-reaching plan of mass control, which was submitted to and adopted by the German General Staff. This plan was to control the population in any given area through mass medication of drinking water supplies. By this method, they could control the population in whole areas, reduce population by water medication that would induce sterility in women, and so on. In this scheme of mass control, sodium fluoride occupied a prominent place. That's what it's about.
As a result of fluoridation, our children will be healthier and happier.
There is no health hazard that justifies postponing water fluoridation.
You're not dealing with a benign substance.
There's much too much risk for too little benefit.
Fluoride is safe.
They decided far too early, before the science was properly in, that fluoridation was a good thing.
The dental community has no idea of the toxicology behind fluoride.
Fluoride does not just affect the teeth.
Fluoride is a neurotoxin.
This is being drank by so many people throughout the U.S. every day.
But who's responsible? Who's the doctor making sure we're not getting too much?
The weight of evidence actually is more in the favor of fluoride doing damage than against.
This is against all principles of modern pharmacology. It's really obsolete.
Water fluoridation is the practice of adding fluoride compounds to the public water supplies for the purpose of reducing tooth decay. The policy, which began in the United States in the 1940s, has been hailed by the Oral Health Division of the United States Centers for Disease Control as one of the top 10 public health achievements of the 20th century. However, a growing body of science indicates that fluoridation is neither safe nor effective. In this video, we examine why over 2,000 health, scientific, medical, dental, and environmental professionals are calling for an end to fluoridation worldwide.
Water fluoridation is the dispensing of a drug.
This is a way of delivering a medicine.
Fluoride is a drug, is a medicine.
Fluoride is being put in specifically to alter you physically, to make a physical change in you.
This is not chlorine. This is not any number of the other chemicals that are used to treat the water, make the water safe and drinkable.
It's not like chlorine used to make the water supply safe and kill the bugs in the water supply.
This is the only thing anywhere in the world that gets added to the municipal drinking waters to actually treat the human, to treat the body.
There is absolutely no drug on the market that's given in a one-dose-fits-all situation.
It's absolutely obsolete. It's in modern pharmacology, it's so clear that even if you have a fixed dose of a drug, the individuals respond very differently to one and the same dose. Now in this case, you have it in the water and people are drinking different amounts of water, so you have huge variations in the consumption.
You can have an athlete, a laborer, who are drinking many, many times the amount of water. You can have someone who's diabetic, who's drinking a ton of water compared to the average.
I mean, the whole name of the game in pharmacology is to deliver the right dose to the right person at the right time. And that's not what fluoridation does. It can't do it.
I would prefer an individual use approach. I would have no problem with a doctor or dentist prescribing fluoride for a patient that he was keeping in touch with and monitoring for possible side effects and for the efficacy of the drug. That's essentially what's done with any other drug, and that's the way it should be done for fluoride. We don't put other things in the water to try to keep everybody's blood pressure down or everybody's stroke risk down, and there's no reason why we should be trying a one-size-fits-all approach for this either.
The problem with adding medicine to water is an obvious one of consent, that people can't give their informed consent, which is a basic of medical ethics.
We're allowing communities to do to everybody in the community what an individual doctor cannot do to an individual patient, and that is prescribe medication regardless of the informed consent of the patient.
What physician that you know in his right mind would treat somebody whose medical history he doesn't know, who he's never met, with a substance that's meant to do change in their bodies, and just with the advice, have as much or as little of it as you like, but you'll take it for a lifetime because it's meant to help somebody else's teeth?
Voters medicate each other whether they want it or not. And if 51% of the voters say, we're going to medicate everybody in town, and they all get medicated.
Fluoride is not an essential element.
There's not a bodily requirement for fluoride.
Fluoride is not an essential nutrient, certainly as far as the UK goes. You look it up in the books to see what our Department of Health says, and they say that no essential use has been found for fluoride in the human body. So it is not in the category of a vitamin, and apart from anything, it's miles more toxic than any other vitamins.
Whatever benefit there is from fluoride on teeth is topical rather than systemic.
It's been shown that it's really a topical effect principally rather than a systemic effect.
It's effective topically, not when it's swallowed.
There's no reason for people be exposing themselves, all their internal organs, to fluoride when, if it works, you can do something topically.
If you want to prevent sunburn, you don't drink suntan lotion, you put it on your skin. And so if you want to have the benefits of fluoride in oral health, what you do is put it on the surface of the tooth and not drink it.
The quality of evidence for topical fluoride is in a different league from the evidence on water fluoridation. I mean, absolutely no question about that.
Adding fluoride to toothpaste, you are going to ingest some of it, and that needs to be taken seriously. But it's not made to be ingested, and it's made to be rubbed onto the surface of the tooth, which is where you're supposed to have it. It's a much smarter way to go about using fluoride in dentistry.
It's widely accepted that the topical application of fluoride to the surface of teeth is beneficial. I have no dispute with that. However, I can see absolutely no justification for asking the whole population to take it systemically, to swallow it, internalize it, for that benefit, because it's available in toothpastes, it's available in dental treatments at the dentist. So I don't think you can justify the fluoridation of drinking water on the lines of a topical treatment to teeth. It's illogical.
One of the recommendations I've made is because we now know that it doesn't need to be swallowed, that the public has to be informed. Again, informed consent. They should be told that it doesn't work by swallowing it.
One of the things that the proponents are very careful to stay away from is to mention how many people don't fluoridate.
Most of the Western world does not fluoridate their water. We are definitely in the minority in the fact that we push water fluoridation.
Many of the countries in the world, the developed countries, no longer fluoridate, never did fluoridate.
Most European countries do not fluoridate. Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, Greece, Portugal. The overwhelming number of countries in the world do not fluoridate, and guess what? Their teeth are just as good, if not better, than ours.
One of the most striking things, I suppose, was to look at trends in tooth decay over time in various countries.
The comparisons between fluoridated countries like America and unfluoridated ones like most of Europe, and indeed most of the world, are very interesting.
If you look at the World Health Organization database for 12-year-olds, that tooth decay has been coming down as rapidly in these non-fluoridated European countries as it's been coming down in the United States and other fluoridated communities.
Areas that don't fluoridate have seen the same decrease in tooth decay that we have seen over the same time span.
If you ask someone to pick out the lines, the decline lines, which are in countries where water is fluoridated, from those in countries where it isn't fluoridated, actually you can't pick them out. So I found that very surprising against the background of, as I say, having been a default fluoridationist.
What you really need to look at and what matters at the end is what's your total body load.
Children are getting a lot of fluoride from a lot of different sources.
We've had a tremendous increase in fluoride from many sources. Water is one source. When we drink that water, when it's made into soda pop or it's made into beverages and made into soups, made into other products, we get fluoride from that source also.
And we also have a lot of pesticides that have come on the market that leave fluoride residues on fruits and vegetables.
Fluoride is a very common component in pesticides. And so, if you drink a glass of grape juice that's a non-organic grape juice and it's got skins on it, you're going to get a very high level of fluoride just from your grape juice.
And they're also getting it from toothpaste. Studies have shown that you swallow quite a bit of toothpaste, or the children swallow quite a bit of toothpaste. Even if they're told not to swallow it, it just happens by accident. They don't rinse as well as adults, and sometimes they don't have as good swallowing actions. And therefore, they're getting a lot of fluoride from that.
So who's monitoring this exposure of when are we getting too much? No one's monitoring that. Nobody's looking at the total exposure to ensure that we're not getting too much and that certain subgroups aren't getting too much.
The reality is we need to reduce our fluoride intake.
In 2005, the Center for Disease Control admitted that 32% of our children in the United States, including children in non-fluoridated areas, have dental fluorosis.
About a third of the children in this country have some form of dental fluorosis, meaning that they had too much fluoride exposure during their early childhood.
Dental fluorosis is damage to the tooth because of too much fluoride exposure. We swallowed too much fluoride, and it shows up as white spots, brown spots on the teeth.
You see these white spots or splotches or lines. In more severe fluorosis, you actually see the surface layer flaking off. You see brown spots.
And in severe cases, there's actual chipping and pitting and erosion of the tooth.
Dental fluorosis is a biomarker that your child has been overexposed to fluoride during the development of their teeth.
We now believe that there are several mechanisms involved. Fluoride could be inhibiting the enzymes, the serine proteinases that are degrading the final traces of proteins that are left behind in the teeth.
The mechanisms have something to do with interference with the enamel-forming proteins or inhibition of some enzymes during that critical period.
To do that, impacting those the enamel cells in the teeth means that it can also impact cells elsewhere in the body.
The promoters have always had this faith that you could damage the growing tooth enamel, the enzymes, the G proteins, or however that happens, without damaging any other tissue in the body at the same time. And I think that's very unlikely.
Not only is it an effect on teeth, what's happening in the teeth is very likely happening in the bone as well, because we have the similar kind of structure of hydroxyapatite mineral structure in the bone and the tooth.
Your teeth are sort of a window into the bone, a window into your skeleton.
So if there's this adverse effects going on in the teeth, there are very likely to be adverse effects going on in the bone.
It's a sign of toxicity. It is not just to be dismissed as merely a cosmetic effect.
This whole debate has been captured for over 50 years by the dental lobby, by dentists whose preoccupation is teeth. Well, teeth are not the only issue in the body.
As dentists, we diagnose pathology of the mouth, diseases of the mouth. And we tend to disregard or not involve ourselves with the diseases of the rest of the body because it's not within our purview, it's not within our license to diagnose other parts of the body.
Most definitely, the dental community has had a monopoly, if you will, on the study of fluoride. And they have absolutely used tunnel vision to look at fluoride as a dental concern. However, it is not just a dental concern. It's a toxicity concern.
The National Research Council has a report that just came out in 2006, which is one of the best sources of finding out what fluoride is doing to the rest of the body.
One of the most interesting things in the report is the diversity of the number of organs that are being affected by the fluoride beyond either the teeth or the bones.
We do need to get away from looking only at fluoride in connection with teeth. We need to be considering its effect on a whole bunch of other systems in the body, on people's general health in a whole lot of respects.
I think the ADA's recent statement on warning against adding fluoridated water to baby formula is a watershed decision.
The American Dental Association has finally done what it should have done years ago, and that is to tell parents not to use fluoridated tap water to make up formula.
The American Dental Association recommends that we not have fluoridated water be used for making infant formula or for infants to drink.
One of the messages which I think is extraordinary in this whole issue is that the level of fluoride in mother's milk is so extremely low. It's 0.004 parts per million, which is 250 times less than we put in the drinking water.
There have been a couple men who have said, well, maybe mother's milk is flawed, but most scientists don't go that route. They say mother's milk seems to be the best we have, the best we know of, and if it's low in fluoride, maybe that's what we should have for infants, is low fluoride.
Nature has devised a system for keeping fluoride away from the infant, and we're circumventing that by putting fluoride into drinking water. And I think there are consequences.
I think parents should know that fluoride is an extremely active chemical when it gets into our body. It can interfere with the pineal gland. It can interfere with the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland and the pineal gland are both intimately involved with brain development, mental development.
A real concern with young kids, especially with newborn infants, is that the blood-brain barrier is not fully developed at that point, and when children are drinking a formula made with fluoridated drinking water, they're getting a huge an inappropriate dose of fluoride in the developing brain. This may be part of the reason, for instance, of the depression of IQ that we've seen in these Chinese studies.
You do not want to create a fluoride exposure during a period of brain vulnerability.
All of these things are indicators, serious indicators, that you shouldn't expose young babies to fluoride. And of course that's exactly what happens when you put fluoride in the water.
How are low-income kids supposed to, or low-income families, supposed to avoid giving their kids fluoridated water?
They can't afford to avoid it. They can't afford to seek sources of drinking water that has no fluoride in it.
I think that the low-income communities could be at higher risk for adverse effects from fluoride exposure or from water fluoridation.
As far as I can see, there is no doubt that the intake of fluoridated water is going to interrupt basic functions of nerve cells in the brain.
The NRC committee did review the available information on fluoride effects on the brain, on neurological function, and we concluded that there does seem to be evidence for some effects. There needs to be more study of several areas. There certainly seem to be effects on the developing brain, but there may also be effects on the brain in older individuals as well.
The research on the brain, since our study was published, has absolutely confirmed what we predicted and what we reported in 1995.
There are now 30 animal studies which indicate that fluoride could damage the brain. And this comes on top of a number of studies from China which indicates that fluoride lowers IQ in children.
I mean, there's lots of epidemiological evidence now that, for example, it might affect the intelligence of the child, coming out of China, and that's been reviewed by the National Academy of Sciences. They say that you can't be absolutely certain about it, but there's quite a strong indication, and we need further research.
In my view, fluoride today, as far as intelligence in the brain is concerned, is where lead was in the early 70s. In the early 70s, scientists knew that high levels of lead could cause brain damage in children and other health effects, but they felt that subclinical levels of lead were okay. I think the same thing is happening now with fluoride, that it's only a function of getting more and more sensitive tests to show that even lower levels of fluoride can cause lowering of IQ and other subtle effects.
You know, while these bits of further research are going on to elucidate what the absolute truth is, we should be taking a more precautionary stance and saying, okay, for the time being, we don't fluoridate.
The concern about fluoride and the effect on the thyroid is multifold.
Fluoride was used to suppress hyperactive thyroid, especially in Europe back in the 40s and 50s. And the doses that were used to suppress thyroid activity are now in the range that people are getting in the U.S. from this vast overexposure to fluoride.
There is a consistent body of literature that indicates that fluoride exposure does reduce thyroid function in humans and in experimental animals, and that the exposures in humans associated with these effects are in the range of exposures that are expected with people who drink fluoridated water.
A large percentage of the population of the United States does have some problem with the thyroid gland.
The large number of people who have hypothyroid, underactive thyroid now, may very well be related to the fact that there's so much fluoride in the environment.
The ingestion of fluoride does affect the actions of the thyroid gland.
A hypothyroid individual should definitely be concerned about drinking fluoridated water because it would take a very serious clinical condition and it could make it even worse.
The effects of hypothyroidism, even probably borderline hypothyroidism, are things like depression, lethargy. When a person just doesn't feel like getting up and doing anything, there are obviously a lot of things that can cause that, but low thyroid function is among them, and low thyroid function is a contributor to depression in some, perhaps many people.
We have several studies, as a matter of fact, in the United States that have shown that fluoride can increase bone fracture rates.
Peer-reviewed studies in prestigious journals such as the Journal of the American Medical Association that's showing increased risk of bone fracture based on the amount of fluoride that a person consumes, and consuming it in the level that people get from drinking fluoridated drinking water.
We do know from animal studies that the strength of the bone actually starts to decline the more fluoride you have in the bone. The fluoride makes the bone more brittle.
Sufficient accumulation of fluoride in the bones seems to make them weaker. It makes them more dense on X-ray film, but this is associated with a more brittle structure.
Of course, we're concerned about hip fractures because that's a huge cost to the healthcare system.
Hip fracture in the elderly, in all too many cases, means that that person is not going to walk again or will even die.
It's well known in the endemic fluorosis areas that the first sign of skeletal fluorosis is aching joints.
The early stages of skeletal fluorosis are associated with bone and joint pain.
Fluoride causes symptoms identical to arthritis.
You cannot distinguish the fluorosis or early fluoride poisoning from rheumatoid or osteoarthritis. It's very much the same.
Nobody, to my knowledge, has yet looked carefully at fluoridated cities or fluoridated populations and looked at the symptoms of arthritis to determine whether or not fluoride is contributing to this endemic or possibly epidemic of arthritis that we have in North America.
I think there's every reason to be concerned that today fluoride is one of the factors contributing to the epidemic of arthritis in this country. According to the CDC, 1 in 3 American adults have some form of arthritis. That's 68 million Americans.
Supposedly the fluoride exposures in this country are not usually high enough to get to skeletal fluorosis, but again, that's an area that really has not been studied well. I think it's likely, it's not a given, but I think it's likely that a lot of early stage skeletal fluorosis does show up as bone and joint pain, but it's never recognized as being skeletal fluorosis.
If I was an arthritic individual, I would be eliminating every possible source of fluoride exposure that I could think of.
If you ask most dentists and ask them what they're putting in the water, most dentists would say sodium fluoride, pharmaceutical sodium fluoride, the same stuff that is in toothpaste.
They have absolutely no idea that it's, in 9 out of 10 cases, hydrofluorosilicic acid, and that hydrofluorosilicic acid is a waste product for the phosphate industry.
This has come about because for maybe 100 years, the phosphate fertilizer industry put out 2 very, very poisonous gases into the environment, hydrogen fluoride and silicon tetrafluoride. Eventually, they were required to capture those, and they did it with a wet spray, water, and that water converts these 2 very toxic gases into hexafluorosilicic acid. And it's this scrubbing liquor, which is about 25% strong, is put into tanker trucks, driven around the country, and added to our drinking water.
If this stuff goes out the stack, it's an air pollutant. If it goes directly into the water supply, if they would take that scrubber liquor and dump it into the local river, it's a water pollutant. But if they put it into a tank wagon and sell it to somebody, a water authority, like magic, it's not a pollutant. And they can take that then to your drinking water supply and not discharge it into your river. They just charge it directly into your drinking water supply, slowly bleed it in, and as magic, it's no longer a toxic pollutant. It's now what's called a product.
It's never purified. It's not a pharmaceutical grade compound. It's a mixture of whatever that collects in the stack gases. And it contains lots of contaminants, a lot of heavy metals.
When you're talking about adding fluoride to drinking water, you're not just talking about adding fluoridation chemicals. You're talking about adding all of the industrial waste byproducts that come along with it. In Oregon, where we've got 135 communities that already exceed the drinking water standards for arsenic, the idea of adding any more arsenic to drinking water, even if it's a small amount, just doesn't make a lot of sense. I find very few people who actually, with an open mind, read through the science, understand the significance of the questions and what the direction that all the new science is pointing in terms of the risks of fluoride, who still go on to say we ought to force it into everybody's drinking water.
We have better ways of improving dental health today than using fluoridation. And let's be sensible about it.
It doesn't work systemically. It works topically.
It is unethical. It is unnecessary. It's ineffective. It's dangerous.
I mean, this is so obvious. It's so really very, very far-fetched. You have the teeth there. They are available for you. Why drink the stuff?
He used to smuggle drugs, and he got caught, and he became one of the government's most valuable informants in the war against cocaine. But last night in Louisiana, Barry Seal's enemies caught up with him and killed him.
The United States government itself may have actually helped bring drugs into this country.
A Watergate special prosecutor, Richard Benveniste,
We all know that there was a secret weapons network in order to supply the Contras. What's new is that some of those who flew guns down to the Contras also flew drugs, they claim, back to the United States.
Clay Shaw, accused by Garrison of conspiring to kill President John Kennedy.
A congressional committee has concluded that President John Kennedy and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., both of them, were probably killed as the result of conspiracies.
The most damaging sealed documents of the House Select Committee on Assassination accuse high-ranking officials of the Central Intelligence Agency of lying to the people of the United States about Lee Harvey Oswald. House investigators believe this man, David Atlee Phillips, met with Oswald 2 months before the assassination. Phillips was the CIA's chief of Western Hemisphere operations and was in charge, among other things, of plots against Fidel Castro.
Secretly delivering arms to Nicaragua's Contra rebels were also involved in smuggling drugs. But officials in the Reagan-Bush campaign made a secret deal with Iran to delay the release of American hostages until after the election.
Casolaro was probing a conspiracy he called the Octopus.
The director of the CIA said his agency helped to introduce crack cocaine into the black community.
That's not the only enemy they see. Even more suspect is a private group called the Trilateral Commission. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney has approved a revised draft of a policy document on the New World Order.
We are back. It is the second segment and final segment of InfoWars Nightly News. If you're not a PrisonPlanet.tv subscriber and you're watching this somewhere elsewhere, please spread the word about the show and alternative media, and please become a PrisonPlanet.tv subscriber if you resonate with this out-of-the-box, true freedom message. Okay, I'm going to move fast now, as I got to get to Webster Tarpley. Geoengineering goes under the microscope in Australia, in one of their major states. And more of their scientists are pointing out there are secretive and now public geoengineering programs going on that governments claim are to protect us from this and that, but the whole thing is super creepy. So we're going to be looking at that. It's also come out that Diebold, and we'll go to that slide here in a moment, Diebold voting machines can be hacked by remote control. This has been proven for a decade, but now they're being hacked with $10 pieces of equipment. And again, that's about all of us more and more losing our rights, but not being able to admit that we're being defrauded. But then it gets worse. First they said it was a joke, but now it's been confirmed that it was not a joke. She seriously told the media, the North Carolina governor suggested suspending elections to spur economic solutions. She said because people will be removed from office if they do things that aren't popular, suspend elections. That's what Governor Bev Perdue, a Democrat, said. And now they've already suspended the Congress, the General House, controlling spending bills. That's now done by a committee of 12 tyrants. So just an incredible, incredible time to be alive. Finally, I want to play a clip of our good friend Judge Andrew Napolitano. He had the district attorney on, the prosecutor in Orange County, California. You know, that's nearby where that homeless guy who did nothing got beaten to death by the cops. And the cops covered it up at first, but finally they've done the right thing, and they've charged one cop with premeditated murder, the other with manslaughter. And the district attorney pointed out, if cops in the wrong are beating you to death, you have a right to defend yourself with lethal force. That's common sense, that's common law, and that's what 1776 is all about.
What can an ordinary person do to resist unlawful violence when the violence is perpetrated by the police?
Well, you know, to begin with, we do have a United States constitutional right to be free from unlawful or unwarranted excessive force under color of law. So that part doesn't vary from state to state, and I think that citizens, or everybody, not just citizens, but we all have a right to self-defense.
Wow. I mean, I shouldn't say wow, but more and more people are just speaking the obvious, speaking the truth. We all got a right to defend ourselves. And it was on record, this homeless guy who's schizophrenic, his dad, by the way, was a retired cop, was just like, hey, man, and they just beat him to death. Reportedly were like doing knee drops into his head for like 20 minutes. I mean, what is, they're hiring a bunch of weenies who like to gang up 5 at a time on people. That's what it is. I mean, no respecting, self-respecting man wants to beat up people who didn't start a fight with you. I mean, it's almost shameful when a bully starts a fight and you break their jaw. Not that I've done that myself, but I've read about it. I mean, it is just so pathetic. And that's good. I hope they stick a needle on that cop's arm, and I hope they send him to hell. Because beating some guy to death who was begging for his mommy and his daddy, all on tape, doing nothing. I mean, there's nothing more cowardly than cops doing knee drops over and over. I'm killing a homeless person. I'm tough. What the hell is wrong with you? Well, you know what? You're going to get strapped down to a gurney because murder one is on your ass, premeditated murder, and you're going to see how it is. Okay, because we don't like weak people being targeted by the strong, by a bunch of wolves. And society is starting to wake up. Now, good cops, we support you. And if you defend yourself, that's great. We'll protect you under common law. But when you like to beat up and kill homeless people or shoot a black kid in handcuffs in the back and say that he was attacking you and that comes out, you don't deserve a year or 2 in jail like the San Francisco case. You deserve to go to prison. Or you deserve an eye for an eye, the killing you engaged in.
A lot of my convictions in joining the Communist Party I received at the university. In the study, for example, of psychology, we were taught human behaviorism and the materialistic conception of psychology.
I always thought the Un-American Activities Committee was doing a good job. With so much trouble in the world, Congress should know about any subversion here at home.
Have you been a member of the Communist Party at any time in the course of the last year?
I have not.
Have you been a member of the Communist Party at any time in the course of the last 2 years?
No.
Have you been a member of the Communist Party any time in the course of the last 3 years?
It's about 25 years ago, back in 1938. I'm out of work, and so are millions of others. People are looking for an answer to the Depression. The Communist Party is on the ballot in several states and has about 70,000 members. They can't get their candidates elected, but they certainly draw a lot of attention. The Ku Klux Klan parades at night. Their plan to save the country calls for getting rid of everyone whose race or religion they don't like.
Audience! Attention! I pledge undivided allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I know it's hard to believe today, but right here in America, thousands wore the swastika and shouted they were patriots and wanted us to do in the USA what Hitler was doing in Germany. Well, we're living in a free country. As long as they didn't do anything illegal, they could say whatever they wanted to. But I guess some people were afraid that the millions of unemployed might be convinced. Congress sets up a special committee to investigate the extent, character, and objects of un-American propaganda activities in the United States. Martin Dyes of Texas is the first chairman.
If colonists are working in our national defense industries for the purpose of sabotaging our preparedness program through strikes, slowdowns, explosions, and other destructive acts, the only way that we can defeat their aims and purposes is to expose them before they strike and to get them out of these industries.
Was the source of your procurement of this information an intelligence source of unimpeachable reliability and integrity?
I consider this such, sir. Yes, sir.
Is it a source concerning which we cannot make a revelation on a public record because of security reasons?
Yes, sir. The source should not be identified in public session.
A lot of information comes from these sources, probably secret FBI agents inside the Communist Party. But the big news comes from what the committee calls its friendly witnesses.
Were you arrested as a hardcore member, a one-time hardcore member of the Communist Party under the Smith Act?
Yes.
Were you actually sentenced under the Smith Act as a hardcore conspirator of the party itself?
Yes.
You have you not, broken irrevocably, finally, from this conspiratorial force?
That I certainly have.
You have found your way back to God and to patriotism.
John P. Fry, official of the AFL, charges scores of CIO unions communist-dominated. Fry names 283 union men as Reds.
Testimony given more than 6 million Americans are subversive. Suspicion cast on certain Catholic organizations, the Boy Scouts, and the Campfire Girls.
J. Parnell Thomas of the Un-American Activities says that the New Deal is working along hand in glove with the Communist Party. All those progressive things. Taxing us just to feed those too lazy to work, using our money to build things in other parts of the country, letting the unions take over. Now we know. It's all part of a red plot.
President Roosevelt has denounced the Dyes Committee as being sordid, flagrantly unfair, and un-American. Leading New Dealers charge that instead of investigating for law-making purposes, the committee and its right-wing supporters are exploiting the public's concern over communism to slander loyal organizations and individuals. But Committee Chairman Martin Dyes defends his expose.
The committee is the only agency of government that has the power of exposure. Therefore, this investigation must go on without fear or favor, and our slogan must be, no quarter to the enemies of our country.
Eric Johnston, Motion Picture Association President, welcomes the congressional investigation of Hollywood.
The motion picture industry has been accused of putting subversive and un-American propaganda on the screen. We deny that without any reservation. The pictures themselves are complete proof of its falsity. We are accused of having communists and communist sympathizers in our employ. Undoubtedly, there are such persons in Hollywood, as you will find elsewhere in America. But we neither shield nor defend them. We want them exposed.
A packed House caucus room. Here's J. Parnell Thomas, chairman of the Un-American Activities Committee, opened the hearings.
This committee, under its mandate from the House of Representatives, has the responsibility of exposing and spotlighting subversive elements wherever they may exist. It is only to be expected that such elements would strive desperately to gain entry to the motion picture industry.
In reply to committee questioning on the employment of communists in the film industry, Mr. Warner states,
I'm absolutely against them. I would not engage them personally. And I've said that, and I will always say that. There's no place for them in the American way of life. I don't care if it's in the motion pictures or in Grand Rapids where they make furniture or in Detroit with motor cars or any other industry. I'm very, very emphatic about that.
In Hollywood, in Grand Rapids, in Detroit, all over the country, business and industry leaders agree with Jack Warner and are firing people. The friendly witnesses provide the names. The committee gives them to the press, and the newspaper headlines tell the public. When a committee of Congress says someone belongs to an organization intent on overthrowing our Constitution, you can't afford to have him working in your place. In fact, you're better off not being seen too near him or his family. people might think you agree with his ideas.
A mammoth parade, including units from Duquesne University, the American Slovene Home Veterans, Girl and Boy Scouts, and the veterans of foreign wars, marches through Pittsburgh's famed Golden Triangle to the Stanley Theater for the world premiere of I Was a Communist for the FBI, Warner's motion picture tribute to a native son of Pittsburgh, Matt Svedek. National Commander Louis Feldman presents Svedek with a citation from the VFW, and Svedek is congratulated by radio's Tommy Bartlett.
Sometimes one of the friendly witnesses, like Harvey Matusto, changes his story and says he's been lying about communist subversion. But most of them stick to their testimony. Without the help of these people, the committee would have a really hard time of it.
Americanism is under attack by communism, at home and abroad. We're defending it against that attack, but Americanism is also under another kind of an attack. The growing practice of character assassination is already curbing free speech, and it is threatening all our other freedoms. For I know you have no way of telling when some unfounded accusation may be hurled at you, perhaps straight from the halls of Congress.
Well, politicians are politicians. It's almost like back when FDR and the Dies Committee were battling. Anyway, didn't Truman start all that loyalty oath and security clearance business himself?
That's not fair play. That's not Americanism. It's not the American way to slur the loyalty and besmirch the character of the innocent and the guilty alike.
I direct you to answer that question.
My name was smeared in the headlines of all the local newspapers. I have been harassed for 1 year.
He is going to give another Communist Party speech.
These are my constitutional grounds, Mr. Chairman, and I wish to state them in my own words.
All right. State your constitutional grounds.
My name is Urban Whitaker. I'm Associate Professor of International Relations at San Francisco State College. Even before the United States Constitution was adopted, there was agitation for a Bill of Rights to be added to it to protect Americans, and particularly their right to dissent. This agitation had its roots in Europe, where for many centuries kings had silenced those who wanted to dissent against them. But democracy and freedom were going to develop. Not long after the U.S. Constitution was established, it was put to a severe test. There were revolutions in Europe, and Americans were afraid. A wave of fear and hysteria swept the country. The Alien and Sedition Act of 1798 made it a crime for Americans to criticize their government. Thomas Jefferson led the successful fight to have the Alien and Sedition Acts repealed.
I know about all that. I learned as a child that it's my duty as an American to think and speak freely and to stand up for other people's right to do the same. The First Amendment to the Constitution affirms my freedom. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
John Howard Lawson refused to answer the question, are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And other questions. He is attempting to thwart the hearings and investigations of this committee.
The Supreme Court agreed with the committee by deciding that the rights of the individual had to be balanced against the national interest, that the Constitution's guarantees weren't absolute.
Therefore, it is the unanimous opinion of this subcommittee that John Howard Lawson is in contempt of Congress.
Nobody wants to go to jail, so now most of the unfriendly witnesses also claim the protection of the Fifth Amendment.
To rest my case solely on the First Amendment would condemn me to years of court action at enormous cost. It would cost me my home and impoverish my family for a very long time to come, which of course is what this committee desires. Therefore, I also refuse to testify under my right not to be a witness against myself, a right originated to protect the innocent.
A person who is accused of a crime and chooses to remain silent can't be tortured or forced to confess like in some countries. You read in the papers every day about someone claiming this right. Nobody goes to jail for doing it because according to the law, you're innocent until proven guilty. But constitutional right or not, the committee tells us that anyone who won't answer its questions must be a subversive. In a lot of communities, you can't hold a civil service or teaching job. And in some states, those who claim the Fifth Amendment can't even get a permit to be a cab driver. It's natural for a Communist Party member not to answer. You needn't have ever actually joined in a plot. Just belonging to the party and understanding communist theories is considered a crime. But why would anyone who wasn't in the party want to keep quiet? Your name is already in the papers, and the committee protects those who cooperate. Even if you were once in the party, wouldn't it be more sensible to tell the committee, especially if you don't believe in it anymore?
I do not like subversion or disloyalty in any form. And if I had ever seen any, I would have considered it my duty to have reported it to the proper authorities. But to hurt innocent people whom I knew many years ago to save myself is to me inhuman and indecent and dishonorable. I am prepared to waive the privilege against self-incrimination and to tell you anything you wish to know about my views or actions, if your committee will agree to refrain from asking me to name other people.
The courts have ruled that once you answer questions about yourself, you have to answer questions about other people as well.
I have ordered you to answer the question. You haven't answered it. Now, counsel, proceed with the next question.
Well, since you refuse me the privilege of answering only questions pertaining to myself, and I will in no circumstances be an informer, you now force me to stand on my constitutional right of not being compelled to testify as a witness against myself.
But isn't the national security at stake? And isn't it important that they get the names of as many people as they can? They must have good reason for demanding this. If I had to do it, I've never had anything to do with this left-wing stuff.
My name is Phil Burton, and I'm a member of the California State Assembly. If I understand the process and the basic concept of our country and our political system, it is the people's right to sit in judgment on the political attitudes of their servants, their elected officials, and not the right of elected officials to sit in judgment on the political opinions of the people.
J.B. Matthews, an ex-Marxist and former Methodist missionary, says that 7,000 Protestant clergymen are Reds.
How could they get so many men of God to join them? Aren't the communists atheists? How could they do it?
Testimony by several expert ex-communists before the committee reveals how Red clergymen hide behind what they call the social gospel.
My reverend is always preaching about things like that. Our duty to our fellow men, helping the poor, racial equality, social injustice. But I've known him for years. He couldn't be one of them, those 7,000.
Of course, no clergyman admits he's a communist when he is one. He's required to keep his membership secret. But he still does communist work.
Dr. Henry J. Cadbury, a Harvard professor of divinity and a Quaker pacifist, belonged to a group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Friendly witnesses told the committee that several other members of the fellowship were Reds. The fellowship called for peace with all nations. The Russians called for peaceful coexistence. The committee said that all this added up to the fellowship being a pro-Red front. According to them, Dr. Cadbury was a member of a subversive organization. Dr. Cadbury was one of the 95 clergymen who worked on the Revised Standard Version of the Bible for the National Council of Churches. The committee said it had information linking 30 of these 95 clergymen, like Dr. Cadbury, to various Red Front groups. Committee Chairman Francis Walter of Pennsylvania declared,
"The leadership of the National Council of Churches, which fraudulently claims to speak for 38 million American Protestants, has in the aggregate a record of hundreds of affiliations with communist fronts and causes."
But national organizations of the Catholic, Methodist, and other churches say guilt by association, as used by the committee, can connect practically every person in the country to the communists and proves nothing. Individual clergymen come out for themselves and criticize the committee, like Reverend Edward L. Peet of Sacramento, California.
I've seen this committee publish and circulate false and defamatory material about church institutions and church leaders. I have seen this committee interfere in a church dispute in a manner contrary to the constitutional principle of the separation of church and state. I have seen them fill their files with derogatory material against people whose views they opposed, and then circulate that material
with a maximum injury. I've seen them employ ex-communists as informers to accuse and bring into disrepute honored ministers of the gospel. I've seen them create in America a climate of suspicion, of fear, and of conformity. I have seen them walk hand in hand with extremists on the right who persist in applying the communist label to the national and world councils of churches.
The committee is about to open its June 1957 hearings in the San Francisco area. Among those subpoenaed is William K. Sherwood, said by the committee to have belonged to a Marxist study group while a college student in 1938. Sherwood, a Stanford University research scientist, was exploring the biochemical nature of cancer and mental illness. He left some farewell letters.
My life and livelihood are now threatened by the House Committee. I will in 2 days be assassinated by publicity. I would love to spend the next few years in laboratories, and I would hate to spend them in jail. I have a fierce resentment of being televised.
My name is Burton Wolfe. I'm editor of the Californian magazine. I was one of those who did not want to abolish the committee entirely, but only to curb some of its abuses. It was because of, and only because of, the demonstration and its aftermath that people like me became completely opposed to the committee. People must ask themselves why such a thing took place. Opposition out here gelled first in 1959 when the committee announced that it would call a group of school teachers.
Mr. Bernard Selba of the California Democratic Council.
We condemn the hit-and-run tactics of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which served over 100 subpoenas to California school teachers and published many of their names in the papers. We don't think the committee has the right to publicly imply that one is un-American without first proving its case. The damage is obvious.
The committee cancels the planned spring 1959 hearings. In April 1960, the committee again announces hearings to be held in San Francisco, and once again public criticism is heard. Thursday, May 12th. Hundreds arrived early at the City Hall for the hearings, announced as open to the public. The committee issues special white card passes to 100 of its supporters, each pass good for several persons. Committee investigator Wheeler says he issued the white cards to keep the communists from stacking the hearing room. The students protest they'd been lied to when they were told that the hearings would be open to the public. A noon rally is held in Union Square, at which 1,000 people hear Episcopal Canon Richard Byfield and California State Assemblymen Burton and O'Connell criticize the committee. The students who organized the rally set up a silent picket line outside City Hall. There are communists inside the hearing room, a small number of the witnesses being self-admitted members of the party.
Open the door! Open the door! Open the door!
They loudly complain that the committee has refused to consider their petition to open the doors to spectators on a first-come, first-served basis.
Open the doors! What are you afraid of? Open the doors! Here comes the goose squad! This is Americanism! Watch this Americanism in action! Oh, watch this Americanism in action! Watch this Americanism!
These communists, or communist pinkos, have to give their name and address, and that stamps them in the community. And it might be an interesting thing to note that if war ever comes forward, which we hope will never come, that different war veteran organizations, knowing these names, can strike the first blow at these people and finish them off before they can do any harm.
Friday, May 13th, the second day. This morning, the guards again let in the white card-holding guests of the committee. And once more, most of the people waiting in line are refused admission. During the noon recess, Sheriff Carberry tells them that their protest singing is disturbing the courts.
If you don't want us out here, are the white cards still going to be let in first?
My dear young lady, I explained yesterday and today as far as white cards. I knew nothing about it, did not know anything about it as far as I'm concerned. So people who are here will be admitted by the committee.
We shall cooperate with you until 2 o'clock. And if you keep your promise and let everybody go into that hall, this time, first served basis, we'll cooperate. Just to the group.
Cooperation.
If the law enforcement agencies do not cooperate with us, we do use our free assembly, our right to petition. We do it orderly, but we do it loudly.
Would you like to give us an opinion?
Well, I would just
say that those poor youngsters are brainwashed. They're absolutely brainwashed. I feel sorry for them. And some of them are nice-looking youngsters.
The students stop singing and line up outside the hearing room. The sheriff gets the committee to agree to admit people on a first-come, first-served basis. But the guards open the doors for the afternoon session and once again admit the white card holders first.
That look as though that if they had a little attention and some baths and their hair combed and some parental discipline, they might become good citizens.
Complaining that they have been deceived, they demonstrate loudly again.
A full-scale riot seems to be underway out there. Fire hoses and everything. Officers started the hosing, came across the barricade, with their clubs out. Self was struck in the face.
Police are hauling out a bearded student. A woman is protesting, and they are dragging her out too. The police have grabbed a Negro and are dragging him down the stairs on his back.
Blood mixed with the water on the floor of the city hall. How old are you?
10.
You're 10. Were you in the rotunda when this happened?
Well, I was over there by the steps.
You were with your brother?
Most of the time.
And how old is he?
16.
And where is he now? Do you know?
In Petty Wagon.
He was arrested.
Yeah.
The television men want some music, put those lights on.
I understand. Do you want the lights on?
I want the lights on, precisely. I want the fullest glare of publicity in this committee's activity.
Are you now, or have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party?
Sir, I am 42 years of age and have never had to face a jury as defendant or grand jury as witness in my life. I have committed no crime under any of the laws of this country and am not engaged in subversion. I certainly shall not answer questions representing allegations against me made by persons not present and not identified, whom I cannot confront and whom my lawyer cannot cross-examine as to their truthfulness.
Do you honestly apprehend, sir, that if you told this committee truthfully while you're under oath whether or not you are now this instant or ever have been a member of the Communist Party, you would be supplying information which might be used against you in a criminal proceeding?
Honorable beaters of children and sadists uniformed and in plain clothes, distinguished Dixiecrat wearing the clothing of a gentleman, eminent Republican who opposes an accommodation with the one country with which we must live at peace in order for us all and our children to survive. My boy of 15 left this room a few minutes ago in sound health and not jailed, solely because I asked him to be in here to learn something about the procedures of the United States government and one of its committees. Had he been outside where the son of a friend of mine had his head split by these goons operating under your orders, my boy today might have paid the penalty of permanent injury or a police record for desiring to come here and hear how this committee operates. If you think that I am going to cooperate with this collection of Judases, of men who sit there in violation of the United States Constitution, if you think I will cooperate with you in any way, you are insane.
Saturday, the third and last day of hearings. 5,000 pickets and onlookers surround City Hall and shout charges of police brutality. The police claim they had to turn on the fire hoses when a student attacked one of them with his own club. The interior of the City Hall is closed to the public. The hearings end without further incident. 2 days later, the committee subpoenas the newsreels taken by San Francisco television stations. These films are turned over to Washington Video Productions, a privately owned studio, and edited down to a 45-minute picture under the supervision of committee staff member Fulton Lewis III.
And I thought you and the wife would like to come over to the hall tonight and see this film put out by the Un-American Activities Committee.
It shows how the Reds have taken over the colleges.
Operation Abolition. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Francis E. Walter, Democrat from Pennsylvania, and Chairman of the House Committee on Un-American Activities.
Operation Abolition. This is what the communists call their current drive to destroy the House Committee on Un-American Activities, to weaken the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to discredit its great director, J. Edgar Hoover, and to render sterile the security laws of our government.
Among the communist leaders who had an active part in the San Francisco abolition campaign and the protest demonstrations were Harry Bridges, whom you see here being escorted out of City Hall by police officials moments before the rioting broke out. One student provides the spark that touches off the violence when he leaps over a barricade, grabs a police officer's nightstick, and begins beating the officer over the head. As the mob surges forward to storm the doors, a police inspector orders that the fire hoses be turned on. The communist and pro-communist press, of course, charge police brutality. Their press accounts of the rioting describe repeated incidents of policemen cruelly beating innocent students. These films, taken by newsmen on the scene and edited only to the point of removing repetition, show a clear example of the lack of respect for truth, which is common practice within the communist propaganda press. Congressman Joe Hampson.
The students whose activities you have just witnessed, whether they realize it or not, are, as I pointed out to them in San Francisco, toying with treason.
Not for the purpose of improving the investigative techniques of congressional committees, or not for the purpose of defending civil liberties as they would have you believe, but for the avowed objective of destroying the Committee on Un-American Activities and our nation's entire security program.
J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, wrote a report on the riots for the committee. In it, he repeats their charge that a student leaped over the barricade and clubbed a policeman. And he also says that the Communist Party was behind the whole thing. I read in the papers that almost 2,000 copies of this film have been sold. Our club bought one to show at the schools here. They're $100 a piece. But some people are asking by what law the committee took over the newsreels belonging to television stations and then gave these films to a private company. 2,000 copies at $100 a piece is a lot of money. Who gets it? And why is it that newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post say the film isn't telling the truth? Why has the Defense Department ordered the armed forces to stop showing it?
Ladies and gentlemen, the film which you have just seen, Operation Abolition, as many of you may not know, is an official document of the House of Representatives of the Congress of the United States. It would seem to me, therefore, that it must, of necessity, be entirely correct, because it is an official document. And I think I can show you very quickly that not only does it have many incorrect statements in it, but that on top of that, these misstatements have not been corrected, which to me is a very sorry thing to have happened to an official government document.
There's only one scene which shows an agitator in the entire film. Those of us who know this young man know his name is Burton White, and that he is a PhD candidate at the University of California, that he's not a communist, and that he teaches in the English department. And I've sat in audiences and listened to people's reaction to this film and heard them say, see that? The film shows that this is a communist leading the students. And they have no way of understanding that these are not the facts and that they are being shown something which is not true. The demonstration was organized by students entirely and carried out by students. This I know after a year and a half of research.
Harry Bridges is made to appear as if he had a part in all of this disturbance, when in actuality, in this one instance, an employee of the committee has actually admitted that at the time of the disturbance he was nowhere around.
That's what J. Edgar Hoover says too.
Order had been restored when Harry Bridges, president of the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, suddenly appeared on the scene. If what J. Edgar Hoover says is true, then the scenes of Harry Bridges at City Hall must have been taken out of their proper sequence and spliced in before the scenes of the hosings. There have been widespread charges that the film is full of such distortions, that it lies about almost everything that happened in San Francisco. But the committee says that criticism of its film is communist-inspired.
The committee definitely says in the film that the whole thing was touched off by a student who jumped over a barricade and hit a policeman on the head. Well, my friends, as a matter of fact, this particular accusation was made against the student that was accused of doing this. He was brought to trial in San Francisco.
My name is Robert Meisenbach. I am a student at the University of California. I did not participate in the demonstrations, but was standing off to the side when the students sat down. Suddenly, without warning, the high-pressure fire hoses were turned on by the police. Drenched to the skin, I tried to leave the City Hall. I was immediately tackled from behind by a policeman, beaten to the floor, arrested, and charged with inciting a riot, disturbing the peace, and resisting arrest, and also assault with a deadly weapon. One of the most important pieces of evidence in the trial was a Life magazine photo, which had showed me standing at least 30 feet away at the time the police turned on the fire hoses. Sworn testimony by dozens of witnesses showed that neither I nor anyone else had resorted to violence against the police. After 11 days of trial and 1,000 pages of testimony, the jury found me not guilty, and all charges against me were dropped.
His case was completely dismissed after a jury trial. He was fully acquitted, and even the prosecution finally admitted in court that they were not presenting any such evidence because there was no such evidence. And yet in the film, it is stated as a fact. And to make matters even worse, my friends, it is even stated as a fact by Mr. J. Edgar Hoover. And I am hoping that he will also now retract it, now that the facts are well known and have been tried in a court of justice.
In addition, we are opposed to the committee out here in San Francisco because we have seen a number of people libeled by what is said in the film and in the House Committee's reports on what took place.
If I should call you a communist, you could sue me for damages. At the trial, unless I could prove what I said about you was true, and this would be open to the rules of evidence and cross-examination, I might be found guilty of libel and ordered to pay you thousands, or maybe even millions of dollars. After all, you might have lost your job, had your whole life ruined because of what I said. Most people don't give you the benefit of the doubt where communism is concerned. But when a congressman says something, he's protected by law from being sued. And when an ordinary citizen appears before a committee of Congress, whatever he says is also protected by this privilege. So if I were to appear as a friendly witness and tell the committee that you're a Red or a fellow traveler, of course this is just for the sake of discussion, just to show you how it works, I could do so without fear of your suing me. I could say whatever I wanted to about you, or your next-door neighbor, or your priest, or even the president. Neither you nor your lawyer could cross-examine or challenge me. It's against the committee's rules. It's in pretty small print, I'll admit, but there it is at the bottom of page 7. The committee has given frequent and diligent consideration to this subject and has determined that in order to carry out its responsibilities imposed by law, the rules of evidence, including cross-examination, are not applicable. Remember that Army major who called Mayor Yorty of Los Angeles a Red? He was only quoting from the files of the committee. The accusation was made back in 1938 by a convicted burglar. And even though Chairman Walter now says the charges are discredited, they were kept in the files for 25 years, and they were used against the mayor in 1962. Even in cases like this, where the committee finally admits that one of their friendly witnesses was lying, they never try to get him indicted for perjury. It might make them look bad for having accepted his testimony in the first place.
My name is Marshall Windmiller. I'm an assistant professor of international relations at San Francisco State College. The House Un-American Activities Committee claims to be a major bulwark against the expansionism of communism, both here and abroad. In my view, this is a false claim. Indeed, As I view this committee, it is a definite impediment toward dealing with this challenge to democracy. There are a number of reasons for this. First of all is the tendency of the committee to create the impression among the American people that all kinds of political reform movements, abroad and domestically, are linked with communism. This creates a climate in which the reform which is necessary to meet the challenge of communism becomes very difficult. It therefore causes contempt for the Congress and for our institutions, both at home and abroad. And by undermining the fabric of American democracy, it weakens our capability to respond to the communist challenge.
We do need the positive approach of a House American Activities Committee, which will search the length and breadth of this land for ways to encourage people to speak their minds.
When the committee held hearings in Atlanta, they subpoenaed Frank Wilkinson, who's been leading a nationwide movement to abolish the committee. They asked him and Carl Braden, a white man active in the integration movement, about Communist Party activity in the South. Rather than claim the protection of the Fifth Amendment, they both insisted that the First Amendment gave them the right to refuse to answer. Both of them were cited for contempt. Frank Wilkinson had to travel across the country to the federal penitentiary. He was invited to speak at the University of California by a student group. Committee supporters demanded that Governor Brown prevent Wilkinson from speaking, but both the governor and University President Clark Kerr insisted he had a right to be heard.
For every voice which asks for abolition of the Un-American Activities Committee and is silenced in jail, 1,000 new voices will be raised. And most significantly, many of these will be the new generation of American students. We will not save free speech if we are not prepared to go to jail in its defense. I am prepared to pay that price.
Are all these people just duped, misled, ignorant of the truth? Or are their complaints legitimate? They charge that the committee, after 25 years of hearings, after spending over $5 million of the taxpayers' money, has never uncovered any information that's brought one person to trial for espionage, sabotage, or treason. They charge that the committee is not concerned with communism at all, but with gaining political power through using the communist label as a weapon against their opponents. They've attacked the New Deal, the Fair Deal, the Eisenhower Republicans. Reverend Wyatt T. Walker of Atlanta says that
we cannot possibly solve the desegregation process in the South without the help of many, many white people of good feeling. And the effect of HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, has been that of penalizing any white person who stands up and tries to help us in solving the integration struggle. It means now that any person who is associated in any way with the integration struggle is a communist or left or labeled as pink. Many of you probably know Carl Braden is the prime example. It is a paradox that he is serving a one-year federal prison term for contempt of this committee while George Lincoln Rockwell runs around loose with his hate bus willy-nilly. If we follow the syllogism of natural logic, one would think, with some exaggeration, that if you want to stay out of federal prison, then join the American Nazi Party.
I can't believe that a committee of Congress would approve of the Nazis. But when they support the committee, a lot of people could jump to conclusions. Chairman Walter says Congress hasn't authorized him to investigate the American Nazis or the Ku Klux Klan. But aren't they un-American? Why doesn't the committee at least reject their support? I'll do anything to protect my family, my country. I did during the war. I forgot about my rights, took orders, killed, but only to save those I loved, the country I believed in. And I've gone along with them. First it was the Reds, fire them, outlaw them, jail them. The rules of evidence, cross-examination, they said we couldn't let subversives hide behind legal procedures. The Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, they said we couldn't let those who are out to destroy the Constitution enjoy its protection.
And who could tell if someone was a subversive, if he was un-American? Why, the committee, of course. The committee could tell who they were, even if they never did or said anything you or I thought was wrong. First it was the Reds, then the fellow travelers, then the liberals, the unions, the churches, the schools, the newspapers, and now whoever dares to criticize the committee. I went along, but only because they said it was to protect America. I've let them convince me that to say freedom, you have to deny freedom to everyone who the committee says is un-American. Freedom for all? Everyone? No matter how unpopular their ideas and opinions may be? That's just an ideal, isn't it? Can we afford to believe in ideals? Can we afford to ask questions? To criticize, to disagree? To think for ourselves?
I direct you to answer that question. 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 I direct you to answer that question.
Israel actually plans to exterminate the entire Arab Muslim population of the world. And the Muslims know this. And this is why their jihadism and their excesses have some basis in reality. They're trying to survive because they know that Israel simply is interested only in genocide and exterminating all the Arab people, bringing them under complete domination. And the Israelis are always exterminationists.
Are they creating a Christian-Muslim war?
Yes, that's all deliberate. See, there is no Christian-Muslim war. Now, I have filed legal papers in this town here before in a law case that I have going on, in which I say frankly that 1 billion Christians and 1 billion Muslims are now at a war to the death with each other, and the only victor will be the state of Israel, because Israel is getting rid of all of its rivals and all of its competitors at one fell swoop. It's a brilliant move, and it's also totally calculated and ruthless.
Is the real enemy Israel?
Yeah. Or Zionism, world Zionism. The state of Israel is nothing. It never has been anything. It's the tiniest state in the world, yet this is the most important state in the world. It's the most important state to the entire United States government because they put the interests of Israel before every other consideration, including the United States. Well, Ezra is the dominant intellectual of the 20th century, and 4 of his proteges have been named have been given the Nobel Prize for Literature after he edited the work. And the first one is T.S. Eliot. He first edited his poem *The Wasteland* in 1920 in Paris, and that became the most famous poem of the 20th century. It's not mentioned very much today, but in the 30s and 40s, every college student could recite *The Wasteland*. And That's how young men would pick up girls, is by talking about the wasteland. They'd get interested and go to a bar and have sex. So it was very useful. And after the wasteland, he became Ernest Hemingway's mentor, and he edited Ernest Hemingway, and he made Hemingway's prose very crisp. And Hemingway had been a hack newspaper writer for a firm called, it was a newspaper called the Moose Jaw Herald in Saskatchewan, Canada. That was his stellar background to become a writer. And so Pound took his material and tightened it up, and he just had a knack for doing that. He could edit anybody's. See, the people, his protégés were all very dissimilar people. T.S. Eliot was a very stuffy Harvard graduate. Ernest Hemingway was a doctor's son from Chicago. His father committed suicide, and he committed suicide when he was 61. And I think one of his sons has committed suicide. So they have a knack for it. And so that was two of his protégés. And then William Butler Yeats is in all the anthologies. When Pound met William Butler Yeats in London, he was a very, very famous poet at that time. But he was writing stuffy Victorian poetry. And so Ezra was horrified by that, and he got him totally out of that and into more modern poetry. And so he became much more famous, and he got the Nobel Prize for that. And then his fourth protégé was James Joyce, who wrote Ulysses, one of the most famous books of the 20th century. And Pound edited that, and James Joyce was a terrible writer. And he edited his prose, and that became the most famous book of the 20th century. It was Ulysses was the Bible of the 1930s. Everybody talked about it. And so there was 4 Nobel Prizes for literature for one writer. It's the only time in history that a writer has ever had one protégé get the Nobel Prize for literature. And by coincidence, I'm his last living protégé. They're all dead, long gone except me. And so I'm patiently waiting my turn. And Ezra Pound himself was never named for the Nobel Prize, although 4 of his pupils were, simply because he never cultivated the establishment. He never, well, in the 1930s and 1940s, you really had to be a very active, outspoken pro-communist to get anywhere. So, of course, he was totally ignored by everybody, except the public. The public liked his work. And his novels were all bestsellers. They made a movie of For Whom the Bell Tolls. That's the most famous book, but he actually wrote some others that were quite good. So Ezra had these 4 protégés who got the Nobel Prize when I met him, and he really jumped on me and started whipping me into shape. And he assigned me to go to the Library of Congress and see what I could find out about the Federal Reserve System. Well, I really had a knack for research, and I found out the entire history of the Federal Reserve System, which is the greatest swindle ever known in history, where a group of private bankers conspired criminally to take over the money and credit of the United States, which they did in 1913, and they passed the Federal Reserve Plan through the Democratic Party in Washington, D.C., and it became a law of Congress. And this law handed over to this private bank all of the money and credit of the United States, which was a pretty good day's work. And they've kept it ever since, because they set it up as a monopoly so that the stock of the Federal Reserve banks could never be traded publicly. It could only be handed down in a family, or if a corporation bought the bank that owned it, they became possessors of the stock. You've never been able to buy, since 1914, you've not been able to buy a share of Federal Reserve Bank stock on the market anywhere. And that is monopoly. That's what they have. It's a monopoly. You see, they're totally insulated against anyone buying control of the Federal Reserve System. And John D. Rockefeller was one of the biggest holders, and he had his stock placed under the Rockefeller Foundation, so it can never be bought or sold. So it's secure forever. And the other people who bought control in 1914 They were the Schiff family and the Warburg family, and of course they still have their own family fortunes, and they have a controlling interest in Federal Reserve Bank stock, in various Federal Reserve banks. It's not all in one Federal Reserve Bank, it's in a number of Federal Reserve banks. And I think most of the holders of Federal Reserve Bank have at least stock in at least 5 of the Federal Reserve banks.
What are the consequences of having the Federal Reserve control the monetary system of the United States?
Well, the consequences are very important, and they're never discussed by any economist in the United States. The Federal Reserve Bank is a central bank. And a central bank, this is not taught in any economics class in the United States or in the world. A central bank is a bank of issue, which has the right to print all the money it wants. That's what a bank of issue means. You can print all the money you want. There's no control over it whatsoever. And right now the Federal Reserve Bank is printing trillions of dollars, which are almost worthless, and they're looking for hyperinflation, actually, because it'll be a repeat of 1924 in Germany. But I think they've taken some precautions. It's probably.
Although it has innumerable advantages, one of the great disadvantages of being able to communicate using a spoken and written language is that it allows us to tell lies. Normally, when one thinks about telling lies, one immediately thinks of doing something that is wrong. But what if telling a lie could save your wife and children from certain death? Would you be doing wrong to tell that lie? It is now thought by many historians that Rudolf Höss, who was the commander of Auschwitz from 1940 to 1943, did just that. Having also been tortured, he signed a confession about his part in the alleged murder by gassing of millions of Jews and others in the so-called death camp, whose name became inextricably linked to what is known as the Jewish Holocaust. Even if torture and duress cannot be proven, the overwhelming reason for recognizing the utter falsity of the Höss confession is that the gassing method he described is not scientifically plausible. Yet it has stood by inference as a testament to the cruelty of Germans in general, since Rudolf Höss was tried at Nuremberg and subsequently hanged on April 16, 1947. Although specific evidence of Höss's torture did not surface until long after he was executed, in February 1948, shortly after the Nuremberg trials were over, the thoughts of one of the American judges, Charles F. Wennerstrom, were published in the Chicago Daily Tribune. The initial war crimes trial was judged and prosecuted by Americans, Russians, British, and French, with much of the time, effort, and expenses devoted to whitewashing the Allies and placing the sole blame for World War II upon Germany. What I have said of the nationalist character of the tribunals applies to the prosecution. The high ideals announced as the motives for creating these tribunals has not been evident. The prosecution has failed to maintain objectivity, aloof from vindictiveness, aloof from personal ambitions for convictions. It has failed to strive to lay down precedents which might help the world to avoid future wars. The entire atmosphere here is unwholesome. Linguists were needed. The Americans are notably poor linguists. Lawyers, clerks, interpreters, and researchers were employed who became Americans only in recent years, whose backgrounds were embedded in Europe's hatreds and prejudices. Of course, any number of refutations can be found for this and other statements which are highly critical of the way in which the Nuremberg trials were conducted, but Wennerstrom's words stand as testament that dissenting voices were already being heard less than a year after the war crimes tribunals were over. But many individuals and groups, particularly Jewish and Zionist organizations, would prefer that the world remains ignorant of these dissenting voices, and have coined the terms Holocaust denial and revisionism in an attempt to silence them. They have managed to persuade the governments of many otherwise civilized countries to criminalize any adverse discussions of the details of the Holocaust on pain of imprisonment or a heavy fine, on the basis that to question any facet of the official Holocaust story somehow constitutes an incitement to racial hatred or something equally nonsensical. I find it offensive beyond belief that a combination of Jews and Zionists has been able to persuade so many governments that the Holocaust is the single event in history on which open discussion will not be permitted, which is a gross infringement of Article 19 in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. But there are those who claim that Article 20 of the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights can be used to take this basic right of freedom of expression away from us. Any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. This is not unreasonable as long as the wording is correctly interpreted. The key word is advocacy, which, according to the Shorter Oxford English Dictionary, means the function of an advocate, pleading for or supporting. So as to make this absolutely clear, one may substitute the appropriate, expanded meaning of the word advocacy into Article 20 as follows. Any pleading for or supporting of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. We should also look at the definition of incitement. The root word is the verb incite, to urge or spur on, to stir up, instigate, stimulate. Thus, incitement clearly means an intention to cause others to take some kind of action. It does not mean providing information which may cause someone to do something illegal. If I told a friend that I'd seen pornographic material on display in a shop where his daughter buys her teen magazines, and he smashed the shop's window and rubbished the offensive material, I could not be held responsible for his actions, because merely imparting information is not inciting another person to take action. Revealing and disseminating material contained in historical documents with a conviction that the information is plausible is not urging or spurring on others to take adverse action against any national, racial, or religious group. To suggest that it is incitement is a gross distortion of language, known as doublespeak. The word incitement has been deliberately misinterpreted in the past, and this must not be allowed to continue, because such doublespeak demonstrates a level of dishonesty that should never have been allowed to insinuate itself into the legislation of any nation which claims to uphold the accurate meaning and spirit of the Declaration of Human Rights. It cannot possibly be incitement to racial or religious hatred to point out that something that is said to have happened over 60 years ago may not have happened in exactly the way it was reported to have happened at that time. The world had not even begun to recover from the unbelievable suffering of hundreds of millions of people, not only Jews, and the deaths of about 60 million human beings for reasons and causes which may never be fully understood. Just as there is no disputing that atomic bombs were dropped on Japanese civilians, the Jewish concept of a Holocaust cannot be denied. But why should it be the only episode in history that is off limits to fair comment and freedom of expression? Whatever the reason, such a ban is certainly not in line with the Declaration of Human Rights, conferring, as it does, a special privilege on one particular group of people over all others. Making certain details of the Holocaust sacrosanct stirs deep suspicions in my mind, because it could mean that there are those who wish to conceal certain facts which may not reflect well on themselves or on those who played an active part in the deaths and suffering of Jews and Gentiles alike before, during, and immediately after that terrible war. I cannot think of any other reason why genuine historical research should be characterized as being offensive to the memories of those who died, or as an incitement to racial or religious hatred. And I often wonder why so many of the people who seem to claim a special privilege of remembrance for their own suffering, or for that of their forebears and co-religionists, are now persecuting and killing others in a land that Zionism has been insisting that they were predestined to settle in since before the beginning of the 20th century. a land already occupied by Palestinians, none of whose forebears were responsible for the death of a single Jew in Europe during the period when the Holocaust took place. It is the utter single-mindedness of those who hunt down and persecute so-called Holocaust deniers and revisionists that I object to. Millions of people, not only Jews, suffered and died horrible deaths on battlefields, on the high seas, and in fire-bombed cities during a conflict that may never have happened, had international jury not declared economic war on Germany. The front page of the London Daily Express of March 24, 1933, says it all. Judea declares war on Germany. Jews of all the world unite. Boycott of German goods. Mass demonstrations. One of the leaders of the movement, Samuel Untermyer, ignored pleas from Jews who lived in Germany not to go ahead with the boycott, for obvious reasons, but on August the 6th, 1933, he said this on WABC New York. Each of you, Jew and Gentile alike, who has not already enlisted in this sacred war, should do so now and here. It is not sufficient that you should buy no goods made in Germany, you must refuse to deal with any merchant or shopkeeper who sells any German-made goods or who patronizes German ships or shipping. We will undermine the Hitler regime and bring the German people to their senses by destroying their export trade on which their very existence depends. Bernard Baruch joined Samuel Untermyer in calling for an economic boycott, and at the same time was promoting preparations for a shooting war. I emphasized that the defeat of Germany and Japan in their elimination from world trade would give Britain a tremendous opportunity to swell her foreign commerce in both volume and profit. And Bernard Baruch was no stranger to the profits of war. After Woodrow Wilson brought the United States into what became known as the Great War, he appointed Baruch chairman of the War Industries Board, where he had control of all domestic contracts for Allied war materials. A service to his country, of course, which it is estimated benefited him personally to the tune of $200 million, over $35 billion in today's terms. Oh yes, wars mean profits, but only for those who don't have to risk their own lives fighting them. Bernard Baruch died in New York City in 1965, 20 years and almost 60 million deaths after the end of the war he'd advocated. When looking at historical events and their far-reaching consequences, it is essential to try and understand the context in which they took place. At the time of the Jewish declaration of economic war, the political picture in Germany was extremely volatile. In certain circles, it has been largely forgotten, perhaps conveniently, that Jews formed a substantial proportion of the Bolshevik elite at the birth of the Soviet Union, little more than a decade earlier, and that many German Jews supported communism during Hitler's rise to power. Those who remember, or who have learned about the McCarthy era in the United States, should be able to understand the fears of Germans in the early 1930s to what many of them saw as the real threat of a Jewish-led communist takeover. Add to that international Jewry's openly promoted aim to destroy its economy, how can it not be understood that a rise of anti-Jewish sentiment in Germany was inevitable and far more rational than it is characterized today?
This is not a Jewish meeting. This is the conscience of America making itself felt.
In that speech, Rabbi Stephen Wise, claiming to speak for all Americans, turned the Jews of Germany into the enemy inside the gates. Make no mistake, this declaration of war was a Jewish initiative and the reason why the Jews of Europe were later herded into concentration camps. Today, with no mention of the context, the not unreasonable fears of the Germans are denigrated as being anti-Semitic, pure and simple. A later circumstance with similar overtones was the fear generated in the United States by the attack on Pearl Harbor, which led to the rounding up and internment of all people of Japanese descent. As a result of their confinement for the duration, many of them lost their homes, jobs, businesses, friends, and savings, and many of them died in those prison camps. But for the imprisoned Japanese, there was nothing similar to the Zionist pact with Hitler known as the Transfer Agreement, which allowed German Jews to head for the safe haven of Palestine. This was only made possible because of the infamous Balfour Declaration of 1917, converted to the Palestine Mandate by the Council of the League of Nations on July 24, 1922, a section of which reads as follows: adopted by the said powers in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And as we all know, the nations involved have done next to nothing over the years to pay even lip service to the rights of the non-Jewish communities that had been well established on that land for hundreds of years. It was nothing less than blatant land theft, arranged between the British and the second Baron Rothschild, who agreed to bring his influence to bear to bring America into what became known as the Great War, to help defeat Germany. To explain the full implications of the transfer agreement would need a feature-length video, so I will just recommend that those who are interested in finding out more follow the links in the notes to this video. However, what can be fairly stated is that this agreement was, without doubt, essential to Theodor Herzl's stated objective as recorded in his diary following the First Zionist Congress in 1897. At Baal, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it. 51 years later, the State of Israel was established. So it is quite clear that the Holocaust was not the reason why the State of Israel came into being, but it can be truthfully said that without the Holocaust, making Israel happen would have been a much more difficult undertaking. There are many articles on the Internet which refer to offers made by the Nazis to the Zionists which indicate that many Jews who died in the concentration camps could have been saved. In his book, From the Depths, published after his death in 1960, Rabbi Michael Dov Ber Weissmandl, a Jewish rescue negotiator, described how he was told by the Nazis in 1943 that he could have all the Jews in Western Europe and the Balkans for $2 million American. The offer was referred to the Zionists in Switzerland, who turned it down. But with the refusal came another letter, written in Hebrew, which included the following: about the cries coming from your country, we should know that all the Allied nations are spilling much of their blood, and if we do not sacrifice any blood, by what right shall we merit coming before the bargaining table when they divide nations and lands at the war's end? Among the thousands of Holocaust books which cast the Germans as the sole and ultimate villains in this tragic story of human suffering, there appears to be no English translation of Weissmandl's book. What a surprise! But then the pages of history are punctuated by the portraits of people who thought nothing of sacrificing thousands, even millions of lives, the lives of their enemies and of their own citizens, to follow their dreams of world domination or a better social structure. The well-protected elite of powerful nations, whether inclined toward imperialistic or socialistic ideologies, show little concern for the lesser people they are prepared to sacrifice for some twisted concept of the greater good. Selling the idea of fighting and dying for one's country or for some esoteric concept of world unity is as natural to them as the act of filling their own pockets with the profits from armaments contracts is for their advisers. So would it be such a great surprise to learn that some lesser people had been sacrificed for the greater good of establishing a new nation based on the ideology of Zionism? For anyone with an interest in these matters, not to even consider such a possibility would suggest a stunning degree of naivety. Or is it that so many otherwise intelligent people have been cowed into silence by the ADL and other anti-free speech organizations? The transfer agreement caused much consternation in 1984, the author's mother saying,
I told him he's not my son anymore.
And his father,
I told him I don't like it. Because as being a Jew, I didn't want something to uncover my own people.
So what is it about the Holocaust story that needs so much protection?
Germans planned and perpetrated the Holocaust. We must confront this fact and accept our own guilt and the responsibility that results from it.
Hang on, some Germans may have done what you say, but not the wonderful German girl that I met in London in 1958. She would have been 8 years old when the war ended. This apparently self-hating German justice minister is claiming that children must bear the guilt for the sins of their fathers. That is a monstrous concept from the book of Exodus, and in my book, far closer to hate speech than many of the criticisms one reads about Zionist excesses in Gaza, for example. Her contribution to a podcast series called Voices of Anti-Semitism ended with this incitement to disregard Article 19 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights.
It remains important that we do not leave any room for Holocaust deniers.
How many times does it need to be said? Questioning certain details about the Holocaust is not denying it happened, but in the interests of balance, it is just as important that we do not leave room for Holocaust liars. The grotesque power without responsibility of the Anti-Defamation League under Abe Foxman, whose accusations of Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism, hatred, prejudice, bigotry and discrimination echo around the so-called free world, resulting in loss of jobs, fines and prison sentences, allows the lies told about certain details of the Holocaust to remain on countless internet websites with impunity. Here is a blatant yet often repeated example. Scroll down and you will find this sentence. In Auschwitz II-Birkenau, more than 20,000 people could be gassed and cremated each day. Yet 23 years ago, the manager of a large crematory testified under oath at a trial in Canada that this allegation was simply preposterous and beyond the realm of reality. On this website there is a teacher's guide to the Holocaust, which includes these chilling statements. 1. An entire state bureaucracy was mobilized solely for the purpose of annihilating Jews. 2. German technological expertise was harnessed to make the mass murder as efficient and low-cost as possible. I have been unable to unearth any specifics about the alleged entire state bureaucracy, official documents, directives, blueprints, and other records which the Germans were known to be meticulous about, and the second statement appears to be at odds with what actually happened. Now, there is no denying that German science and engineering was second to none at the beginning of World War II. Planes, tanks, the V-1 and V-2, and other weaponry were quickly developed, and their rocket scientists were snatched up by the US and the Soviets for their space programs at the end of the war. So the question is, given the technological expertise that was available, were the Germans so stupid that they would leave it to prison camp commanders to devise their own methods for carrying out the greatest mass murder in history? Here are some excerpts from Hearst's Nuremberg testimony. I had the order to produce extermination facilities in Auschwitz in June 1942. The camp commander of Treblinka used monoxide gas, and according to his opinion, his methods were not very effective. When I built the annihilation building in Auschwitz, I therefore used Zyklon B, a crystallized hydrocyanic acid, which we threw into the death chamber through a small opening. It took 3 to 15 minutes, depending on the climatic conditions, in order to kill the people in the death chamber. Zyklon B is in pellet form. The absorbed hydrocyanic acid vaporizes at 25.7 degrees C, although some vapor is given off when the pellets are exposed to air. Despite the mention of climatic conditions, unless the air and the concrete floor of the gas chamber were approaching a temperature of 25.7 degrees, a killing period far in excess of 3 to 15 minutes would have been required. The average yearly temperature at Auschwitz is 8 degrees C. So was Hearst so stupid that he devised a system of mass murder that would only have worked with any degree of efficiency during the summer months? It is of no consequence that claims have been made that in the cold months hot air was blown into the alleged gas chamber, because it would have been an absurdly inefficient method of liberating gas from pellets that were already lying on a cold concrete floor. and Hearst's confession continued. We waited, usually a half hour, before we opened the doors and removed the bodies. Please note that Hearst does not mention any ventilation procedure which would have been essential for removing the remains of a deadly gas that had just killed upwards of 2,000 people, nor has any evidence of a chimney or the necessary machinery ever come to light. Earlier, in a confession which was obtained under extreme mental and physical duress, this paragraph appears. I commanded Auschwitz up to December 1st, 1943, and estimate that at least 2,500,000 victims were put to death and exterminated there through gassing and burning. At least a further 500,000 died through hunger and sickness, which amounts to a total number of approximately 3 million dead. However, it has since been discovered that this number was wildly inflated and was officially reduced to just over 1 million in July 1990 by the Auschwitz State Museum. And there are those who are convinced that this estimate is still too high. Each and every one of these deaths was a tragedy, as were the deaths of millions of others during this terrible conflict. But this does not mean that we should be prevented from finding out how and why they died. So along with the revised death toll and Hearst's scientifically impossible gassing method, the following should be taken into account. Stephen F. Pinter, who served as a lawyer for the United States War Department in the occupation forces in Germany and Austria for 6 years after the war, made the following statement. I was in Dachau for 17 months after the war as a U.S. Department attorney, and can state that there was no gas chamber at Dachau. What was shown to visitors and sightseers there, and erroneously described as a gas chamber, was a crematory. Nor was there a gas chamber at any of the other concentration camps in Germany. Dr. Charles Larson, a highly regarded American pathologist, was appointed by the Judge Advocate General's Department to investigate the conditions and the cause of so many deaths in the camps. After overseeing thousands of autopsies, he concluded, not one case of death by poison gas was found. As Dr. Larson and other Allied medical men discovered, the chief cause of death was disease, above all, typhus. It is well known that hydrogen cyanide was used at the camps for the delousing of prisoners' clothes and other materials, for the very purpose of keeping them alive, and in the labor camps, productive. As would be expected, the efficient Germans installed purpose-built machinery to heat the Zyklon B pellets, to retain them for recycling, and to ventilate the rooms following each delousing cycle. And again, it must be asked, were the Germans so stupid that they would have left it to the various camp commanders to deal with the far more daunting task of murdering millions of human beings? Historian Robert Faurisson, who has been persecuted, prosecuted, beaten up, fined and fired from his job for daring to exercise his right to free speech, provides a clue. For more than half a century, Germany's accusers have in the end revealed their inability to let us see a single specimen of the alleged weapons of mass destruction that the Nazis are said to have designed, built, or used for the destruction of the European Jews. If you recall the concerns that Charles F. Wennerstrom had during the Nuremberg trials, this should be of equal concern. A former U.S. Senator, Thomas Dodd, who became second in command of the American prosecution team, wrote the following on September 25, 1945, 2 months before the trials had even begun. You know I have despised anti-Semitism. You know how strongly I feel toward those who preach intolerance of any kind. With that knowledge, you will understand when I tell you that this staff is about 75% Jewish. Now my point is that the Jews should stay away from this trial for their own sake. For mark this well, the charge of a war for the Jews is still being made, and in the post-war years it will be made again and again. The too large percentage of Jewish men and women here will be cited as proof of this charge. Sometimes it seems that the Jews will never learn about these things. They seem intent on bringing new difficulties down on their own heads. I do not like to write about this matter. It is distasteful to me, but I am disturbed about it. they are pushing and crowding and competing with each other and with everyone else. The undeniable fact that at least 2 of the judges expressed grave concerns about the conduct of the trials cannot be lightly dismissed, so the following questions have great relevance. Was the evidence given by Stephen F. Pinter that there were no human gas chambers in any of the German camps overlooked or deliberately suppressed? Was the evidence given by pathologist Dr. Charles Larson that not one case of death by poison gas was found, overlooked, or deliberately suppressed? How could the obviously absurd figure of 20,000 people being gassed and cremated at one camp in a single day have been accepted by the prosecution and defense lawyers, as well as the judges, without question? How could it be that no scientists were questioned about the plausibility of Rudolf Hösse's confession as to the method he stated was used to gas thousands of people at one time in one unheated, unventilated room at Auschwitz using unheated Zyklon B? No nation, organization, association, no religious sect, no open, closed or secret society, nor any individual has the right to prevent me from seeking the answers to these and other questions, should I choose to ask them privately or publicly. It is my right under the protection of Article 19 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It is also yours.